Testing, testing, testing.
Okay. All right. Something happened here. Yeah, I know. May have to go back to the whiteboard one day. Okay, good. Okay, why don't we get started? Yeah. So I have a little echo here. It's my pleasure to introduce Grand Priest. He needs no introduction, but I will give him one anyway. That's it. Yeah. We all know him, and if you don't, you should, and his work. He's, I think, most famous for his work on paraconsistent logic, as well as his defense that that some contradictions are true. The position he calls dialethism. But he has a lot of interests beyond philosophy of logic and truth. He's interested in metaphysics, epistemology. He's written a lot on the Buddhist tradition, and he reads widely and is in dialogue with many world traditions and philosophers. So in some way, I think his way of philosophizing is a model for the future, and in some way, he is an untimely thinker. Okay. So yeah, it's my pleasure to introduce Graham, both whom now I consider a friend, but also a mentor for the past 10 years or so. Let me give you just a quick summary of some of his books and papers and some background. So he's from the UK? Originally, but now he's a son of Australia. Yes, so he worked at the University of Western Australia, University of Queensland, Melbourne University, and then he moved in 2009 to CUNY. He was a distinguished professor of philosophy there at the Graduate Center from 2009. And now he's moving to Sendai, Japan. So we're very happy that we'll be able to have him closer to us, that we'll be able to see him more often and hopefully have him here again. He's been the president of the Australasian Association of Logic, as well as the Association of Philosophy, and he has over 250 papers and many books. I just mentioned one of these papers, Logic of Paradox, 1979, I think a seminal paper for those of you working in logic and math, it goes without saying. Some of the books, there's In Contradiction, one of his earliest, if not the earliest book. There's a new edition of this coming out, I was just told, soon. Beyond the Limits of Thought, one of my personal favorites. Doubt Truth to Be a Liar, a lot of good titles. One thing that you see here, Towards Non-Being, Fifth Corner of Four, an essay on Buddhist metaphysics, and there's some other books. He has a new one coming out the end of this year. Nothing, oh, sorry, July. Okay, so next month. Okay, sooner than I thought, July. And it's called Nothing in Particular. It's about something, it's about nothing in particular. Bad jokes. Just a couple of things. Yeah, I mean, over the past 10 years, I've learned a lot from Graham, both his writing, but also his way of doing philosophy, his openness, and also his real humanism. I've been lucky to do a Hegel and dialethism seminar with him. We did that online during COVID, as well as to collaborate on some writing stuff for this book that he did with Marcus Gabriel. So it is, yeah, my absolute honor to welcome him back. It's been almost 10 years since we had you here. So welcome back, and we're looking forward to hearing your talk on Nishida and nothingness. So please welcome Graham.
Okay, thank you very much for the kind introduction, Greg. And let me thank you and your colleagues for inviting me here. As you said, I was here. Okay, excellent, thank you. I was here nearly 10 years ago and enjoyed myself very much. So I'm delighted to be back. and thank you for putting on this event, which has been terrific. I'm going to spoil it now, but it's been good so far, all right? I want to, let me just check to see if my remote works. Okay, it only works from certain angles, so I'll have to restrict myself. Okay, I think what's happened. Okay, so I'm going to talk about this guy. Now, if I were anywhere else in the world, I'd have to explain who he is and why he's important, but this is sort of the one place I know I don't have to do that, so let's move on. Okay. Clearly, he's the most important Japanese philosopher of the 20th century. A lot of people responded to his work, used his work, and so on. Roughly speaking, his works fall into three periods. We heard about the first period from Dennis this morning, and we heard about the third period from Eugene yesterday. I'm going to talk about the middle period. So this is the Basho period, and I'll tell you what Basho is in a minute. But it's where the notion of nothingness comes to play a central role in his thinking. And okay, hence the title of the talk, which is Nishida and Nothingness. I'm going to tell you what he thinks nothingness is and how it functions and things like that. Okay, in fact, let's see if this works. Okay, good. So this is a book on three of the major Kyoto philosophers, Nishida, Tanabe, and Nishitani. And this is by Jim Heisig, and he calls it the philosophers of nothingness, because the notion of nothingness dominates the Basho period, but also dominates the thought of these other central Kyoto school figures. So I'm going to talk about nothingness. All right. Now, one of the things that makes Nishida interesting is the fact that he's clearly in the tradition of Japanese philosophy. Yeah, there's a tradition of Japanese philosophy. It's mainly, they're not entirely Buddhist, but he's seeped in Buddhist philosophy. In fact, he's for a long part of his life, he practiced Zen. And he takes Zen philosophy and uses it. He never tells you this till right at the end, when sort of near his deathbed, he says, well, you know, I've been talking about Zen for the last, 40, 50 years. But he's in dialogue with the West. So he's one of the first Japanese philosophers to engage with Western philosophers, largely, but not exclusively, German. And it must have been pretty bloody tough, because he didn't speak any European language well, as far as I understand. So he's sort of reading this stuff in translation, and the translations at this time are not good. But he's picking up all kinds of things from Western philosophers, and he's trying to integrate their insights into the perspective he's trying to draw of the world. And Jim Heisig once said to me, look, there's one thing which dominates Nishida's thought, it's understanding what enlightened consciousness is, enlightened in the Zen sense, okay? And if you don't understand that, you do not understand what the hell he's doing. I mean, he's not an easy philosopher to read, as many of you will have experienced. Even in Japanese, his texts kind of ramble, and he talks about one thing and then something else, and it's not clear how the pieces are supposed to fit together, or even if they do fit together, and often I think they don't. But he's attempting to produce this bricolage of a coherent view by taking Western insights and imposing them or combining them with his Zen tradition. Okay, so we've heard quite a bit about Western insights in the last day and a half. I'm going to talk about the Zen insights, because as I said, if you do not understand what he's drawing on from Zen philosophy, you have a hell of understanding what he's doing. So this is where we're going, if the remote works. Okay, so there are two main parts to this talk. I need to tell you what Zen is. We could spend the rest of the month talking about this, but I'm going to tell you what I think you need to know to understand Nishida. And that's going to be roughly the first half of the talk. So there's a lot to cover there. And when we've done that, I will talk about his theory of Basho,
and you will see how this is a version of Buddha nature, or at least one of the Basho. Of course, there are several. The most important one is Zetai Mu, absolute nothingness, non-dual nothingness. Okay, so those are the two parts of the talk. So let's just start with a prolegomena on Zen. Now, Zen is, of course, originally a Chinese form of Buddhism, distinctively Chinese. It's called Chan. When it goes into Japan, it's called Zen. But you cannot understand Zen unless you understand where it is coming from, because it's itself a function of many pieces being put together. One might wonder about the coherence of this, but it does. You have to understand the Indian Buddhist tradition, and you have to understand what that sort of morphs into when it meets the Chinese culture. So, first of all, we're going to do this, and I'm going to talk about reality and the mind, and then talk about how the pieces fit together. All right, so let's talk about reality. I'm sure you all like reality, or realities, okay, because there's more than one. So in Indian Buddhism, there are two realities, conventional reality and ultimate reality. So in Sanskrit, Samvriti Satya is conventional reality, ultimate reality is Paramattha Satya. And there's general agreement across all the Buddhist traditions about what conventional reality is. It's the reality you're familiar with. It's your Lebenswelt, okay? There is an enormous amount of disagreement amongst the various Buddhist traditions as to what ultimate reality is. So I'm not going to talk about all of them, but we do need to talk about Mahayana Buddhism. So Mahayana Buddhism is a kind of Buddhism that starts about 500 years after the Buddha, about the turn of the Common Era, and it's founded by this guy, Nagarjuna. We don't know a lot about him, where he was, we don't know his dates, but he founds, or at least he sort of collects together the growing tendencies of this new form of Buddhism, which has a very distinctive take on ultimate reality. So, first of all, the objects of conventional reality for Nagarjuna are empty. That does not mean they don't exist. It means they exist in a certain sort of way. If they're empty of something. What are they empty of? Well, they're empty of this thing, svabhava. It's a Sanskrit word which means self-nature, self-being, intrinsic nature, if you like. So the earlier form of Buddhism thought that some things had intrinsic nature, and Nagarjuna attacks this picture big time. For him, nothing has self-nature, everything is empty of self-nature. So all conventional objects are empty, shunya, they're empty of self-nature. That means they are what they are, only in relation to other things. So it's building on a picture of interdependence, right? So ultimate reality, shunyata, emptiness, in Chinese, it's this character. In Japanese, it's that character, kong or ku, depending on what language you're talking. Amazingly enough, that turns out to be empty as well. That's one of the central verses of his work. If it's empty, its being depends on something else. What, I hear you ask? Well, he doesn't tell us, and that's the topic of debate in subsequent Buddhist schools. So I might say that all the Buddhism that goes into China and then Japan is Mahayana. They're all versions of Mahayana. I think what ultimate reality depends on comes out clearly, most clearly in the Chinese tradition, but I'm not going to be talking about that, at least much, today. This is the most important thing, that, and this is a quote, without distinction and free from conceptual construction. In other words, we use concepts to describe our Lebenswelt. In fact, our Lebenswelt is partially conceptually constructed. but you can't understand the notion of a university or being Australian or being married without using concepts. Concepts construct our conventional reality. Ultimate reality, if you're using concepts, you're talking about conventional reality. You're not talking about ultimate reality. So if you say to me or him, well, hey, Graham, what's ultimate reality like? You can't say anything. Well, okay, that's a bit too simple. Officially, you can't say anything. But of course, he talks a lot about it, as do all the Mahayana philosophers. So already you have here the origin of, a simple contradiction that you cannot talk about it, but perforce you do. That's going to resonate through the whole bloody tradition, right? So in the language, in Sanskrit, it's called tatata. Tata means that. It's what you say when you point. Tatata is thatness, but it's often translated as suchness. In Chinese and Japanese, it's translated by this character. Those are the pronunciations in Chinese and Japanese. So ultimate reality is ineffable. And you're stuck with this problem that you talk about it. All right. So that's Madhyamaka. When Buddhism goes into China, it meets the indigenous philosophies, and in particular, it meets Taoism, which is the indigenous philosophy, which is most instrumental in the development of Chinese Buddhism. And Taoism depends on a couple of pre-hand texts. It can be interpreted in many ways, but one particular interpretation is influential in the development of Chinese Buddhism, and that's the Neo-Taoist interpretation of Wang Bi, who's 2nd century in the Common Era. And according to this interpretation, behind our experienced world, our Lebenswelt, there is this principle, Tao, of which these are the manifestations. Okay, but the Tao itself is not an object. The objects are the things in our phenomenal world, and so since it's not an object, you can't talk about it, it's ineffable. And the very famous first line of the Tao Te Ching is, the Tao that can be talked about is not the timeless Tao. The timeless Tao, the real Tao, is ineffable. Okay, and it's commonly described in China and Japan as this. Wu, if you're Chinese, mu, if you're Japanese. So it's nothing, because if it were a thing, you could talk about it, but you can't talk about it, so it's wu, as opposed to these things, the beings. So that's the character. In Chinese, it's yo, in Japanese, you. So there's a contrast between mu and you. Okay, and in Chinese Buddhisms, the distinction between the ultimate and the conventional in Buddhism and between mu and you, those two distinctions become elided. So mu, Tao, it becomes identified with ultimate reality, and you it becomes identified with Lebenswelt. Okay. So already you get a significant influence of Taoism on Chinese Buddhism. So you'll find in the Chinese Buddhism, you'll find the ultimate referred to both as Kong and Mu. Kong is what you talk about when you talk about its emptiness, and Wu or Mu is what you use when you're talking about its ineffability. Okay, so of course we're going to be talking a lot about this. All right, so in both traditions, the ultimate is ineffable. That's one thing they agree on. But both say a lot about it. The Tao Te Ching is full of discussions of Tao, and Buddhist texts, even in China, are full of many discussions of ultimate reality. So again, you hit this apparent paradox right at the start of, well, halfway through the Buddhist developmental tradition. Okay, so that's reality, or the two realities. Now, that's one thing you've got to get your head around to understand Zen. But the other thing is not reality, but mind. And if you want to know what's going on in Zen in mind, you have to go to the other branch of Indian Mahayana Buddhism, which is Yogacara. I mean, that's what it's standardly called, but it's better to call it Chittamatra, mind only, because that's what it is. It's a form of idealism. It's a rather strange form, as I'll point out in due course, but it's standardly interpreted as a form of idealism. And this is due to a couple of 4th or 5th century Indian Buddhist philosophers, Asanga and Vasubandhu. And as I said, it's standardly interpreted as a form of idealism. There is no reality outside the mind. All reality is in the mind. And of course, they give arguments for that, which we needn't go into, but that's their view. But because they think that reality is in the mind, they have a very sophisticated analysis of how the mind works. And it has 8 parts. Okay, so 6 of the parts are kind of straightforward. They're to the ones through with sensory consciousness, sight, hearing, touch, and thinking of, which is also a sensory modality in this context. And these have a subject-object duality. So if I'm seeing a tree, there's a duality there between me and the tree. Okay? So the high levels of consciousness, those that are associated with sensory modality, have a duality. That's important. But there is a deeper level of consciousness, which is at the bottom. It's rather like the unconscious in modern Western philosophy. It's something you're not normally aware of, but it stores the results of experience which play out in your experiences. So it's called the alaya vijnana in Sanskrit. Alaya means storehouse, because it stores the results of what you've been up to so that it affects what you do. So this is karma, right? Karma is what you've done affects you and other people. And I've given you the Chinese characters. Obviously, those are transliterations, right? But those are the characters. The alaya stores the karmic seeds, which sort of bubble up from your unconscious into your conscious, the sensory modalities, to produce the external world, or what you think is the external world, but it ain't, because it's in your mind. All right. Now, moreover, every object has 3 natures. The parikalpata, Peter Savabha, is the imagined nature. So it's the nature it has. When you see a tree, you think it's in the external reality. It's not, it's in your mind. But it has an imagined nature of being in external reality. That's its imagined nature. The dependent nature, the paratantra svabhava, is the nature it has in virtue of being dependent on other things. So this is emptiness, right? In particular, the things, the goings on in your mind, which produce the imagined nature. And then you have the consummate nature, which is its ultimate reality. And its ultimate reality is an ineffable flow of experience. Again, like Madhyamaka, if you use concepts, it's helping to construct your lived experiences, not ultimate reality, which is just this continuous flow of experiences. And if you start here initiating this, you're not a million miles away. Okay, but the consummate nature, since it's ineffable, is non-dual. There's no, it's this, it's that, which will be a duality. And in particular, there's no subject-object distinction in consummate nature. So the subject-object distinction disappears once you access the consummate nature of something, ultimate reality. And in Chinese Buddhisms, there is a tendency to identify the consummate nature of something with the alaya. So the alaya is what sort of ultimate reality is, at least once it's purified of the karmic impurities. So you get this identification of the alaya, part of your mind, with ultimate reality. Okay, now, unfortunately, there's another part of the picture you need to understand, and that is Tathagata Gava. Tathagata is a name for the Buddha. Tathagata means thus gone to enlightenment. GABA is a womb or a matrix. So Tathagata GABA is the part of you that is already enlightened. Yes, you're already enlightened, okay? You just don't realize it because you're kind of misguided by the part of your mind which is kind of deluded, okay? And enlightenment is not getting somewhere, it's getting rid of something, namely the delusion that you're not enlightened now. All right. So those are the characters in China and Japan for Tathagata GABA. Okay, so every being has a part that's already enlightened, and the aim of enlightenment is just to sort of realize that, yeah, got it. Okay, now in Chinese Buddhism, there's also a tendency to identify this with the alaya, purified of karmic traces. Okay, so you tend to get this fusion. The consummate nature of something is the same as the purified alaya, which is the same as the Tathagata GABA, and that is enlightened mind, and it's called Buddha nature. Okay, so those are the characters. It's pronounced differently in China and Japan, but that is your Buddha nature. It is the part of you which is already enlightened. Okay, so already you see you've got a fusion of at least 3 bits of Indian Buddhism producing the notion of Buddha nature. So let's put the pieces together, and this is this is a picture that's behind a lot of the Chinese Buddhisms, including Zen. Notice that reality is in the mind. That's direct from Yogacara. The conventional is the effable, the dual aspect. So the conventional aspect has a duality, it has a mind subject-object duality, but the ultimate is the ineffable, non-dual aspect of mind, Buddha nature. Okay. And now I told you that Yogacara is a strange kind of idealism, because if you talk about Western idealisms, there is a mind, you know, think of Kant, think of Hegel, which is doing the grasping construction of the outside world. But in Yogacara, ultimate reality has no duality. The things which you think are dual, like me seeing the tree, is just a conventional construction. And I am just as much a conventional construction as the tree. Okay, so subject-object duality disappears, and I exist no more than the tree. Okay, so there's this kind of twist where in ultimate reality, subject-object duality just disappears. The mind is just as much a conceptual construction as its object. And so, and this is important, ultimately, there's no distinction between consciousness and its content. So, I mean, if you're some kind of realist, you think, well, there's me and there's the tree out there. So reality is one thing, my consciousness of it is something else. No, there's only one thing, ultimately Buddha nature. Buddha nature is both your enlightened consciousness and the reality that it's capturing. Okay, so all there is really is just tathata, suchness, this sort of constant, continuous stream of ineffable stuff happening. But the Chinese Buddhists talk about it as much as all the other Buddhists, even the Zen people, who really take the ineffability of tathata most seriously. All right, so here's the key points about Zen that you need to take away into the discussion of Nishida. First of all, in Zen, there isn't ultimate reality, mu. Secondly, it's ineffable, a simple tathata, which means you can't talk about it, but you do. It grounds conventional reality, because conventional reality is constructed by imposing a conventional grid on the ultimate, and it's non-dual. Particularly, there's no subject-object duality. And if you're familiar with Nishida, you'll see these things coming through in his thought already, but I'm going to point out where they do come through. Okay, and in particular, this non-dual ultimate reality is your enlightened consciousness. So as Jim Heisey said to me, look, what Nishida is really after is an analysis of enlightened consciousness. That is Buddha nature, that is ultimate reality. These are all the same thing. Okay. So let me see. That's the prolegomenon on Zen. Now I want to talk about Nishida, but let me just pause because some of you will know some of this stuff and some of you may be meeting this for the first time. So let me just pause for a moment to see if there are any clarificatory questions about the stuff I've talked about Buddhism. Okay, let's get on to Nishida. So, in the middle period, Nishida constructs his theory of Basho to try to overcome some of the shortcomings of the first period, and it feeds into what he does with social political philosophy in the third period. So let's start with the word Basho. That's the character, and it means a place. If you want to sound erudite, you can translate into Greek and call it a topos. And it can literally mean a physical place, but it's much more abstract than that. So it's a place in a much more general sense. So there's more than one Basho. Nishida is going to give us a theory of what Basho are, how they're structured, and what we're going to see is one of them is really important. There's a whole hierarchy of Basho, but one of them is the one ring that binds them all. And this is going to be Zetai Mu, non-dual reality, non-dual place. So let's take this slowly because it's complex, and it's actually more complex than I'm going to describe. It's often hard when you read Nishida in this period. Oh, well, I should tell you what the period is. This comes from an essay of 1926 called Basho. All right, and it's hard when you read Basho to sort of figure out which Basho he's talking about sometimes, and there's no single plural distinction in Japanese, which makes it harder. So I'm sure the big picture is kind of more complex than this, but the simple version will do for what we need today. So let's start with the Basho of predication. So let me draw you a picture. Here's the moon, M, and here's a predicate, is a sphere, right? And the moon is in the Basho of sphericality. So this is a Basho of predication. So the Basho is provided by the predicate, the universal, if you like, and the things inside it find themselves in the place of sphericality or the universal. Okay, now, this is a relative nothingness. So have we got the, Sotai Mu, a relative nothingness. This is not Zetai Mu. This is just one of the Basho. And what makes it a relative nothingness is, well, first of all, what makes it relative? It's relative because S is not inside the Basho. So as far as this Basho is concerned, S is not a thing. It's not a thing in the Basho. It's a nothingness relative to that Basho. So this is a relative nothingness. It's not an absolute nothingness because I told you these Basho are going to be nested in each other. There's going to be a hierarchy, and S will actually occur in the bigger Basho. So S is a nothingness relative to this Basho, but it's not a nothingness relative to the Basho that contains it. What is that? Well, the next Basho is the Basho of judgment. So when I say the moon is a sphere, I just made a judgment, right? And so the Basho, which contains the moon being in the sphere, is one of the things in the Basho of judgments. Okay, so the next level of the hierarchy is the Basho of judgments. And the Basho of judgments will contain that judgment, but all the other judgments you make. Okay, so the next Basho of judgment looks like that. And again, this basho is also a relative nothingness because J is not in itself, but it'll be in the next one up. Okay, so as I've insisted or pointed out, the basho are cumulative. So everything in S is in J, but also S is in J. So as the basho get bigger, they contain everything in the bashos inside. Okay, now that's the next basho up. It's the basho of judgment. To understand the next basho up, you've got to understand a crucial distinction that Nishida makes, because he talks about consciousness, but there are different kinds of consciousness according to Nishida. There is intentional consciousness, and intentional means having a subject-object duality, and there is true consciousness, or sometimes Nishida says consciousness in general, or the transcendental predicate. So I write intentional consciousness as CI, and true consciousness as CT. And the next level up is going to be CI. So the basho of judgment is going to be the basho of intentional consciousness. And look, because if I keep putting the contents of the inner basho, the picture gets cluttered. So I'm just sort of removing those, but they're there. So this is the basho of consciousness. So in CI, you get everything that's happening in your intentional consciousness. Think the higher levels of Yogacara. So there are all the judgments you make, these guys, but of course your consciousness does other things. It has desires, it plans, it wants. So all those things are going to be in CI. They're part of your intentional consciousness. Right. So judgments are part of consciousness. There's a difficulty here because this word judgment is ambiguous, and it's an ambiguity that bedevils philosophy in the West since Aristotle. It's cleaned up only in the end of the 19th century by Frege and Husserl, who understand that the word judgment is ambiguous. And I'm told this is true in Chinese as well. It's probably true in Japanese. Because a judgment can mean an act, or it can mean the content of the act. So if I say, she made the judgment very fast, I'm talking about the act, because I'm talking about its speed. If I say, her judgment was true, I'm not talking about the speed, I'm talking about the content. Okay. Now, clearly from this construction, Nishida is identifying the judgment with an act. But the moon is a sphere. When we started, is a judgment, content. So there is, I'm afraid, a sort of confusion here. But in Nishida's defense, you might want to point out that if you're thinking in Yogacara terms, even the content of what you say is in your mind. It sort of takes us back to some of the discussion of meaning this morning. So perhaps the sort of taking judgments, the content of judgments, to be in the mind as well as the actions of judgments, maybe that's not quite so disastrous. But anyway, for better or for worse, that's it. And I might say, I'm not defending this picture, I'm just telling you what the picture is. All right, so that's the basho of consciousness. All right, but we haven't reached the big daddy, the one basho that joins them all yet. That's coming. All right, so okay, so this is the true consciousness, CT, is it's got everything else in it. So here's the basho of intentional consciousness, and I've moved the things from inside outside so you can see the subject-object duality that's involved, because these things have subject-object duality, and intentional consciousness actually is conscious of itself. So, you know, that goes round in an arrow. But everything in the intentional consciousness is in ultimate consciousness, true consciousness. And this is absolute nothingness, zetai mu. In Japanese, I understand zetai means non-dual, because in CT, there is no duality, okay? Think Buddha nature, because this is what it really is. It's both mind, also ultimate reality. These are the same thing, remember? So Nishida has finally fashioned a structure, let's call it that, which captures Buddha nature, which is something he's been after ever since inquiry into the good. I might just say that this is a hard picture to draw because when you kind of draw these things, you cannot indicate that a circle is inside itself. It's just physically impossible in two-dimensional Euclidean space to draw a circle that's inside itself. You need at least 3 dimensions to do that. But it's going to turn out that zetai mu is both the biggest sphere, but it's going to be inside itself. Yep. Is that a contradiction? Yep. Is Nishida aware of that? Yep. So that's the kind of the structure of Basho. Now, let's see how this plays out in Nishida. So Nishida is really hard to take quotes from because he goes all over the bloody place, all right? So I've chosen my quotations carefully, but then everybody has to choose their quotations carefully because his expositions are, shall we say, ill-structured themselves, but that's okay. So, first of all, let's remember the features that I told you that Buddha nature has, and let's just think about these things from the point of view of zetai mu. So, first of all, zetai mu is nothing. Right, why? Well, he explains. We can first of all simply distinguish between the nothing that negates a certain thing, that's a relative nothingness, that is relative nothing, and the nothing that negates all being, that is absolute nothing. So absolute nothing is no thing, because it negates all things. So the true one, that's sort of a back reference to Plotinus, actually. I mean, you're going to see that he picks up concepts from Western philosophy and kind of sneaks them in, well, incorporates them into his thinking. So the true one, that's zetai mu, must be the place of absolute nothingness, something that can never be determined as a being, but within which every being is, and by which every being is seen. Seen because it's a form of consciousness, right? So zetai mu is nothing. It's not a thing. However, haven't we just talked about it? Yep. Doesn't that make it a thing? Yep. We've seen that coming from the Buddhist tradition. Is Nishida aware of this? Yep. Nothing, however, is also an object of thinking. It becomes a being by adding some kind of determination. In other words, when you predicate it, when you apply some universal to it, in the sense that the species is included in the genus. Okay, it's sort of a subset relationship. Being is in placing nothing. Needless to say, even to think of it as nothing is to think of it as an already determined being. So it's nothing, but because you can speak about it, it's in the basho of predication, and therefore in the basho of itself. That's why I said it's kind of a hard diagram to draw. So zetai mu is something and nothing, and this is him saying it, it's not me. All right, that's the first thing. So, and he says it again. At this point, one might question how absolute nothingness can possibly determine itself. In reply, it must be stated that absolute nothingness is not simply non-being anything, but is rather the ultimate noetic determination. Obviously, that's coming from Husserl. It is the essence of spirit, coming from Hegel. It is both absolute nothingness and absolute being. Because inside, it's not in itself and it is in itself. Because it's in itself, it's a being. Because it's not in itself, it's not a being. So zetai mu is ineffable because there's no bigger basho for it to occur in. Okay, Given two opposed judgments, X is and X is not, behind the grammatical subject X, there would have to be the basho of nothing transcending affirmation negation. You can't say it is, you can't say it isn't. An independent predicate plane, that which illuminates endless dialectical development, would have to be this predicate plane, and there's no such thing. So Zetai Mu is ineffable. Okay, but hang on. Nothing, however, is also an object of thinking. It becomes a being by adding some kind of determination to it. When you predicate something of it, in the sense that the species include the genus, being is emplaced in nothing. Needless to say, even to think of it as nothing is to think of it as an already determined being. So it's ineffable, but hey, because you can talk about it, it's ineffable. So he's explicitly recognizing the contradiction to which the Buddhist tradition that he's drawing on has been committed for nearly 2,000 years. This is why, in the purely intellectual standpoint of consciousness in general, that's Zetai Mu, we fall into an unavoidable contradiction. Consciousness in general, whilst being the epistemological subject of judgment, must be that which has transcended the act of judgment. So he's well aware that this picture is contradictory. He's telling you that it is. Okay. Next, Zetai Mu is the ground of reality. That which is must be emplaced in something. Otherwise, the distinction between is and is not cannot be made. So reality, what is real, is what is in Zetai Mu. So Zetai Mu is the ground of reality of objects. Again, this is straight out of the Buddhist playbook, because conventional reality is a construction out of ultimate reality. It's obtained by taking your conceptual grid and placing it on ultimate reality. So even in Nagarjuna, conventional reality is grounded in ultimate reality. And, Nishida is pointing out that this is going on here. So true nothing, Zetai Mu, must be that which envelops such being and nothing, that is, there's things in it both are not, or are not. It must be a basho wherein such being and nothing are established. The nothing that opposes being by negating it is not true nothing. Rather, true nothing must be that which forms the background of being. And if Heidegger is tinkling in your ears at this point, you're not wrong. Okay, so Zetai Mu is the ground of reality. So it's both an object and it's not an object. It's both effable and ineffable. It's the ground of reality. All these things are coming out of the Buddhist tradition, as I pointed out to you in the discussion of Zen philosophy. Okay, let's have just another couple of quotes where he points out that it's the ground of reality. The ultimate universal, that's Zetai Mu because it's the biggest universal, has the sense of being the noematic plane, where that's coming from, of the self-conscious of absolute nothingness. Our entire life is reflected here. In this way, objective determination receives its deepest and most profound foundation. So the foundation of reality is Zetai Mu. And he goes a bit purple in this one. When the self-consciousness of absolute nothingness determines itself, its noemetic plane is the topos of the final universal that determines all that exists. And its noetic direction, in its noetic direction, we find the flow of infinite life. I mean, give him a sort of a chance to be a bit sort of rhetorical or metaphorical or poetic. No, this is it. All right. So this is the structure of Basho. You've seen occasional allusions to German philosophy, and many people have talked about other allusions, which are other kind of concepts in German philosophy that Nishida is drawing on. Now, I'm not telling you they're not there, they are, because he's taking these insights from German philosophy and he's trying to build them into his Buddhist conceptual scheme. So what I've concentrated on in what I've just said is the Buddhist background. Because if you only see the stuff from German background, you won't understand why the hell he's doing this. Because he's doing this because he wants to make sense of Zen metaphysics, to the extent that you can say Zen has a metaphysics. Okay. Oh, good. So that's really the guts of what I wanted to say. I want to go back to Buddhism for the last thing, because what I've been telling you is that in Buddhism, ultimate reality is non-dual, and it's ineffable, and I've been describing it. Okay, that's a contradiction. I mean, do Buddhists really say things like that? They do. Okay, I'm going to finish by describing to you a sutra. It's called the Vimalakirti Sutra. It had no influence whatsoever on Indian Buddhism, but it had a profound influence on Chinese Buddhisms and particularly Zen. And it's a great sutra. Its hero is a layman who's very, very enlightened. He's smarter than all the bodhisattvas who come to visit him. It's very funny. It has jokes in it, which you don't normally find in sutras. It has a woman in it, which you don't find in most sutras, and the woman is no less a goddess. Okay, and the topic of the sutra is a few things, but one of the things is non-duality. Okay, so here's a kind of drawing of his bedroom. So you see he's in bed and he's malingering. He's not really sick, but he's pretending to be sick. So all the people will come to see him. So these are bodhisattvas, okay? They're guys who are really smart, very advanced on the path. This is the goddess. This is Manjushri. We'll come back to him in a minute. And he's pretending to be sick, so they'll come and see him. And they say, how are you? Vimalakirti, and he say, I'm okay today. Tell me what you've been thinking about. Tell me what your thought on Buddhism is. And they tell him, they say, well, you know, that's not quite right. Let me teach you. So he's pretending to be sick so that people will visit him, and then he can teach them. And he's the real hero of this dialogue. Incidentally, he comes from a place called Luchi. I think I got it right. So you'll see references there, which you'll wonder about if I don't tell you. Okay, so he's in this room. He's malingering. All these bodhisattvas that come to visit him say, how are you going, Vimalakirti? There's quite a few of them, about 10,000. He must have a very big bedroom, but that's okay. You know, he's very advanced in Buddhist technology, so you can have a bedroom that size. Okay, so at one point in the sutra, something comes up for discussion, namely non-dualism. And the chapter, presumably put in by the editor, whoever that was, calls this chapter Entering the Gate of Non-Dualism. And that's what the chapter is about. So they decide to talk about non-dualism. And so Manjushri, who's the sort of biggest bodhisattva of all, says to all the other guys, okay, what is it to enter the Dharma gate of non-duality? What is non-duality? And they go around the room, and each of the bodhisattvas, who I remind you is very far advanced on the Buddhist path, says what it means to be non-dual. Okay, so I'm not going to give you all of them. Let me just give you two. So the Bodhisattva Narayana declared, to say this is mundane and that is transcendental is a dualism. The world has the nature of voidness, so there is neither transcendence nor involvement, neither progress nor standstill. Thus, neither to transcend nor to be involved, neither to go nor to stop. This is the entrance into non-duality. And Manjushri says, okay, not bad, next turn. And then someone says, the Bodhisattva Priyadasyana declared consciousness itself is voidness. Voidness does not result from the destruction of consciousness, but the nature of consciousness is itself voidness. such understanding of the 5 compulsive aggregates, never mind what they are, and the knowledge of them as such by means of gnosis is the entrance into non-duality. Okay, so they're all explaining how to get rid of dualities in one way or another. And they go all around the room doing that. It's only about 20 of them. It's not the case that all 10,000 are involved. You'll be pleased to hear. Okay, so they go around the room. And then it's Manjushri's turn. Now, Manjushri is the bodhisattva of wisdom. So he should know what he's talking about, right? Because he's the sort of wise guy. Actually, that's not a happy way of putting it in Western vernacular, but he's the wisest of them. All right, so Manjushri replied, "Good sirs, you've all spoken well. Nevertheless, all your explanations are themselves dualistic. To know no one teaching, to express nothing, to say nothing, to explain nothing, to announce nothing, to indicate nothing, and to designate nothing, that is the entrance into non-duality." Okay. Then you get this. Then the Crown Prince Manjushri said to the Lichavi Vimalakirti, that's where he comes from, "We've all given our own teachings, noble sir. Now, may you elucidate the teaching of the entrance into the principle of non-duality." Remember, Vimalakirti is the real hero of this dialogue. And Manjushri has just said to him, well, you know, what is it? Remember, Vimalakirti is there to teach them. What do you think Vimalakirti says? Thereupon, the Lichavi Vimalakirti kept his silence and said nothing at all. The Crown Prince Manjushri applauded the Lichavi Vimalakirti. "Excellent, excellent, noble sir. This is indeed the entrance into non-duality of the bodhisattvas. Here there is no use for syllables, sounds, and ideas." So Vimalakirti didn't say anything. He was silent because you can't talk about the ultimate reality because it's non-dual. But hey, that's what Manjushri has just said. So Manjushri has said what Vimalakirti showed. In fact, what the non-duality here is being transcended in a rather interesting way, because Vimalakirti has shown what it is to transcend duality. Mouth shut. But what he's done makes sense only in the context of what Manjushri has just said. If Vimalakirti had fallen asleep, his silence would mean nothing. It means what it means only because it's contrasted with what Manjushri has just said. And what Manjushri has just said is what Vimalakirti has shown. So the duality has been transcended by both showing that you can't describe something and showing that you can. So the thought that you can transcend a duality by being contradictory is here in this sutra. And as I said, this sutra is highly influential in the development of especially Zen. Okay, so I thought I'd finish with that sutra because it shows you that, you know, Nishida is not inventing this stuff. He is drawing on the tradition of Buddha nature and its contradictory properties. Okay. Oh yeah, I thought I'd just finish with that. I've said everything I was going to say. Yeah, well, I'll just tell you, this was we're having a seminar on dialethism in Kyoto, and we went out to dinner, and these are all the people who were coming, but they put us on the guest list. Okay, thank you.
So I can pass it around to folks. Thank you very much. All right. So we have 30 minutes. Let's start over here. Start with Adrian and then Shuyu. Yeah, and please keep your questions concise. So 2 or 3 minutes. Yeah, just a reminder. Thanks. Oh yeah, and don't put it too close.
Hi, Professor Priest. Thank you so much for a stimulating talk. My question is about the logic of Basho. So I'm not familiar with Nishida, so this might be a naive question. I know a bit about logic. So in logic, there's bilateralism about negation and rejection and assertion. So would it be accurate in any way to describe Basho as employing a kind of bilateralist logic here? The thought being that there's a distinction between asserting, negating, or asserting its falsity. That's my question.
I wouldn't call this structure Basho a logic, okay? But it does get described that way. What is clear is that this structure is a contradictory structure, and there are going to be contradictions through it. And I use the word contradictory in the logician sense, right? P and not P. It is and it is not ineffable. Now, so if you want a logic to describe this structure, you are going to have a logic, a formal logic in the logician sense, which allows it to be the case that P and not P. Now, in most Western logics, let me be careful how I say this. There are modern logics which show you how to do that. They're called paraconsistent logics. Never mind the technicalities, take my word for it. But orthodox logic, for most of the 20th century, didn't allow you to do that. So the logic constructed by Frege and Russell, often called classical logic, even though it's only constructed at the end of the 19th century, it's still called classical logic, does not allow this for those technical reasons I won't go into. But paraconsistent logics shows you how you can do this. So you can say that something is true, it's ineffable. You can say that it's false, it's not ineffable. So that's okay. Now, I told you that this word assertion has plagued Western philosophy since Aristotle. So has the word denial. So just as the word assertion is ambiguous, so is the word denial. And generally speaking, to deny something is not the same as asserting its negation. We can go into that if you want. I wouldn't say that these guys are asserting it, denying it. I'd say they're asserting it and its negation. The full force of that won't be familiar to you. I mean, we can talk about it if you want. But it's true to say that if you want to describe this kind of structure, you need a logic which allows you to have both P and not P. And that's a paraconsistent logic.
Okay, Shuyu, right? You're next. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Professor Priest, for your very rich talk. And I found it very inspiring to interpret Middle Nishida in terms of Nyoraizo school and the study of Buddha nature. And I also find it, so you are also sort of at the same time reinterpreting Nyoraizo as absolute nothingness.
I'm missing a word. I'm reinterpreting
The school of Buddha nature.
I don't think I'm reinterpreting. I'm giving you Nishida's analysis of Buddha nature.
Yes.
Incorporating the theory of Basho. And I think he gets it pretty much right, to be honest.
Yes, that's also my question, because I think a lot of, especially critique on the school of Buddha nature would say that it's a school of monism. For example, critical Buddhism would say that the school of Buddha nature is a form of substantial monism,
Yeah.
and so you would say that they are getting it wrong, and Nishida is getting it right.
I thought that the word substantial, I'll come back to that in a second, but it's monistic in the sense that it's non-dual. The whole point of it is to construct something that's non-dual, not one, not two. In that sense, it's monistic, right? If there's a close analogy in Western philosophy, which I don't think there is, it's something like Russell's neutral monism. But it's some kind of monism, depending on how you kind of describe that. Does it mean there's one substance? No, because Zetaimu is not a substance. Remember, Nagarjuna got rid of substances 2,000 years before this, and Nishida is not reneging on that. So it's not a substance. It's a monism without substances, without any substance.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Kobe, here you are.
Yeah, thank you for your talk, Professor Priest. It was a very compelling reading of the logic of Basho. So I do have two questions. The first one is more of like a technical one, and I was thinking you could elaborate or elucidate a problem that I have with the reading of the logic. So it seems to me that being here is to be predicated upon something. And if you have this hierarchy of Bashos, right, which ultimately terminate at the Basho of all the Bashos, which is Zeta Mu, I feel like that is not, that I don't think it's sufficient enough to say that that's the hupokemenon, because ultimately that absolute nothingness is still a determinate nothingness by virtue of it determining itself. So there has to be, I think, to have a true, authentic absolute nothingness, a higher order nothingness, right?
That's how you can say something about it.
Right.
And it's not easy. Is it a contradiction? Yes.
Yeah.
That's what he tells you.
Yeah.
Look, when you make this stuff, you're in the land of contradiction.
Yeah.
Get used to it.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, but then, like, I feel like you still have to differentiate between that which can be predicated in that basha, between that which is external to it, because you can now say that there is just nothing external to that basha, right? Okay.
Yeah, it's itself to itself. Is that a contradiction? Yes.
Okay. I guess that does segue kind of nicely to my second question. So, like, yeah. So you do claim that Nishida is a deity. So can you give me some concrete examples of contradictions here that are not true, if only some are?
Nishida,
Yeah.
you're a frog. You're a frog and not a frog. Okay, that's not true. That's one of the conjuncts, not true. Namely, you're a frog.
You're not a frog.
Yeah.
Do you want to keep going?
No,
Hey,
I
you're
think
good?
it's okay.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Okay, good. Now the hands are coming up. Now the frogs are the Here we go.
Velvet always gets them going.
Yeah, I have a whole story about frogs because of the village I live in, but I'll leave that for later, okay? There you go. Thank you very much.
Sure. Thank you, Professor, for the talk. I have a question related to maybe the Dennis talk earlier about the difference paradox, like how basically how the finite is possible if from the infinite background, right? And I think Yogacara seems to give a plausible answer, at least a heuristic answer, is that from the alaya vijnana, there's seeds and manifest activity, and there's sort of like a transformation between the manifest activity and the seeds that account for the finite consciousness, basically. I'm wondering,
Just let me ask you, what do you mean by finite?
finite being every oppositional contradiction, the relative contradiction that can account for the judgment as a content.
So, finite just means it has some content.
Yes, finite content that can
I mean,
constitute relative yeah.
good. So, I mean, in reference to this morning, it was made clear that it has meaning. And meaning in this context means you can apply some concept to it.
Yes.
So, if you can apply some concept to it, then it has a meaning, right?
Right.
Now, since Zetamu is in the basho of judgment, it has content. Because you can say something about it. So because it's not in itself, it's not in the basho of Zetamu, so you can't say anything. And that's the contradiction that Dennis was describing this morning, if I understood him right. And in the basho period, one thing that makes him move towards basho is a way, this is how I read it, it's a way of handling that contradiction.
Yes.
So he looks as though he's stuck in the contradiction in the early period. In the basho period, he comes to accept it. But it's not ad hoc, because he's drawing on his Buddhist tradition. I've shown you there are sutras in the Buddhist tradition, like the Vimalakirti Sutra, which tell you exactly how to do that. And he knows his history of Buddhism.
I guess it's more like how this contradiction can be possible in the first place. So we can talk this later.
Well, exactly, if it's actual, it's possible. So what's worrying you? I'm not saying you aren't worried by something, but just tell me what it is.
So in the Yogacara, the seeds and the manifest activities transformation itself is
Sure.
change. Like technically speaking, it's beyond something that we cannot know discuss. Whatever we cannot know discuss
Yeah,
belongs to the
it's
first
inevitable.
seven, and it belongs to the I that approach
That's true.
like a mana cosmos.
But that's what Bandu and the same
Yes.
they describe it.
But they have this sort of more real reality, which is this transformation between the seeds and the manifest
No,
activity.
that's something that happens. You know, I start my life with Nilaya, sort of poisoned by
So
seeds, and they disappear.
they can account for, right? They can,
Sure, I mean, there's a transformation going on. And nothing I've said denies that.
right. No, I don't agree with you on that. I'm just wondering whether there'd be some account for this finite mechanism that happened in the Mishnah. That's actually the question.
Oh, yes, because, I mean, he's talking about the flow of infinite life.
Yes,
There's
exactly.
change going on.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you do find that in the Buddhist stuff, because the whole point is becoming enlightened. Obviously, that is a change. But it's here you get a lot of Hegel coming in, because Hegel is the sort of theorizer of change in the West par excellence. So you'll see that a number of the things he says in the Basho essay actually invoke Hegel very strongly. And it won't be the quotes I gave you, but Hegel is there big time.
Go on to the next one. Okay, right here.
Okay.
Not too close.
Okay. Thank you very much for Professor Priest, your speech. My question is about mainly the notion of nothingness, and it is Buddhist origination. Because as you indicate, you base your speech about the Nishida based on the three Mahayana Buddhism school, Madhyamaka, Yogacara, and Dadagaba. But as I know, the anti-realities in the ultimate realities in the three nature of Yogacaras, it is not about the nothingness, but something ultimate reality. So in both China's and Japan Buddhism, especially Huayan school in Japan, Gekonshu, the Huayan scholars, Fa Zhang in Japanese also, he characterized he rewrites the three nature of Yogacaras into metaphysics. And in his metaphysics, the most basic and ultimate reality is the suchness, Zhenru. And I'm not sure why Nishida, the basic or fundamental notion is nothingness, but not the opposite, the mu, you.
Take it from me, it's in the text. Read Dogen, read Jizang, they will all refer to our reality as mu.
Yeah.
Or you. I mean, okay, in Kegel, in Huayan, it's referred to as li, principle.
Yeah.
Okay? But it's just as ineffective for them as it is for Tentai, for Chan, and for Pure Land. I mean, it's common to all the Chinese.
And I also noted that in the books edited by you and another philosophers about the fundamentality, your paper, the title of your paper is Buddhism Dependent, in where you deal with the ontological dependence between Huayan. And do you think that the metaphysical relation between Li and Shi, or principle and phenomena, is like maybe something about grounding or is an essential relations. Another question.
Oh, okay. It means essentially having relations. So that's right. So what you find in Nagarjuna is that everything is empty. So everything depends on being what it is on something else. What you get in Huayan, by some rather interesting moves, is a universalization of that. Namely, everything depends on everything else. Okay? So that's a kind of, I told you that ultimate reality in Chinese Buddhism is sometimes called Mu, sometimes called Ku. And the Huayan stuff is developing the idea of Ka, because it's universalizing the dependence. So that's there, but they think that Li is just as ineffable as all the other schools of Buddhism.
Thanks so much. Let's go to the next question. Francesca?
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation and especially for the connection between Nishida and Nagarjuna. I have a question about your interpretation of Basho. If in your interpretation plays a role the difference between go and shu tai, so the subject in the sentence and the subject in the action, I don't know, it's late shu tai.
If I understand the question right, if you have a sentence, I see a tree, that's that sentence. It's not the mathematical subject, but suppose it's true, that refers to a state of affairs. And the state of affairs itself has a subject of individuality. I mean, we might argue how that state of affairs are, but presumably the state of affairs of nice and true comprises me and the tree and maybe Steve. Okay? So, the grammatical structure and the structure of the fact and reality are going to be kind of isomorphic on the same point. So to say there's no duality is, in the first instance, it's stated about the fact, and secondarily, it's stated about the sentence. It says that the sentence can't be true because there's no duality of fact and reality, no sentence which has a true structure can be true.
Thank you.
Then Sabdashwa, I think.
Thanks so much, Professor Priest. I want to take the cue from the Vimalakirti Sutra, which you discussed towards the end. And the way I see it is, I see a value hierarchy which is established by the end of the sutra, where we have three different proposals. One is keeping silence. I take the English translation very seriously. The act or the fact of keeping silence versus silence as such versus speaking of silence. I think these three different sort of articulations occupy different positions with respect to Mahayana and Nagarjuna and Shunyata in general. But I think while there might be a suggestion that Vimalakirti takes the cake by the end by keeping silent, whereas Manjushri in talking about silence or speaking of silence sort of in a way fails to, concretize it. I seem to think that, maybe there is merit in speaking of silence as such, because for this, because again, I'm just reading what your speech in general, you have uttered something very interesting. You said, when you're talking about Tao, you said, we can't talk about it because it is nothing, right? And then you said, if it were something, we could have talked about it. So there is this underlying proposal that speech is possible. Speech in general, emerges from a position of presence, or speech presupposes ontology of some sort. But on the other hand, I think speech is possible or speech is required precisely because there is nothing. So you can speak only because there is a nothing. So I speak is a symptom which sort of try to cover up for a nothing which is underlying thing. So, and that's why I think speaking of silence versus keeping silent or silence itself, speaking of silence is in some ways perhaps better. And that's why we have theory, we have philosophy. That's why Nishida also is doing what he's doing. Yeah.
I'm told that online, people can't hear you very well. So either I'll pass the mic back.
All right.
So please make a second.
Okay, look, I don't deny that how you interpret what's going on is going to be contentious. And the interpretation you've given, I think, is possible. I don't think it's quite so plausible because remember, this is about the transcendence of duality. And what Vimalakirti does is a manifestation of transcending duality. But it's only a manifestation of transcending duality in the context of what Vimalakirti has just said. So the transcendence of duality is that one shows what the other said. Okay, that's the way I think it's most plausible to interpret the transcendence of duality. And that's the way it's taken up by at least a number of Zen thinkers. So it's taken up by Dogen, for example. So one of the fascicles of the Shobogenzo is sort of a discussion of this, and it's about the transmission of the Dharma. When the Buddha says to his disciples, what is it to be enlightened? And three of the people present say something, and the fourth one just smiles. Okay? And the sort of standard understanding of this is that the first three who speak haven't done it, but the guy who smiles has done it. He's shown it, okay? And what Dogen says in this fascicle is that's wrong. They've all done exactly the same thing. They've all got the essence of the Dharma. They've just done it, they've just expressed it in different ways. So I'm not going to deny that there are other possible interpretations of that chapter of the sutra. There are lots of other chapters, but at least the interpretation I've given is very standard in Zen. You find it in Dogen, and I think Nishida is Soto, not Rinzai. So he's in Dogen's part of Zen.
Okay, Kyle, mic is yours.
Thank you so much for the talk. You had this kind of exciting reference to scene in your talk, and it's from the text that Basho's in is from the acting to the scene. And I must admit, this is like my embarrassment as a Nishida scholar, that I kind of know what from the acting to the scene is, but I kind of don't. So I'm wondering if you can explain to me a little bit more about like how acting and seeing connect with like conventional and ultimate reality within this Buddhist interpretation. Yeah, acting or actor is another way that they kind of do it, or more just seeing is what I'm.
Yeah. Okay. So time moves, sees itself, because it's one of the objects inside it. So you will find places in Basho and elsewhere where he talks about so time moves up and it sees itself. See because it's full of consciousness itself, because it's in a contradictory way inside itself. I don't know if that addresses your concern on this topic.
No. So it's the Basho of absolute nothingness, paradoxical. It's great.
Yeah, but I mean, there has to be more to something than that, because seeing is an action. I mean, and so we come back to the changes that are going on within the Basho. And it's not stasis. Experience reality is in a state of flow. So there's a story about change that has to be told in order to say more of that.
So it's like the judgment as both something with content and also an act.
Yeah. So if you want to identify with judgment, the concept. That's going to be right. And as an addition, I think that's confusion. But coming from the Gregory story, I might call that knowledge branch.
Okay, let's go to John.
Thank you, Professor Priest. And I want to ask about, because I'm not very familiar with this, I want to ask about, because it seems that involves neither nor, but not both and in the non-duality. And also you have talked about contradiction. And thus I want to ask about, in your interpretation, does Nishida reject the principle of non-contradiction and the principle of excluded middle in the same move or separately? So can we deal with that separately also? Thank you.
Sorry, here you are. Sorry, I forgot.
The important thing is that non-contradiction and excluded middle are different principles. I know that if you read people like Hegel, they run them together. He's confused, I'm afraid. Ask any modern logician and they will tell you that these are separate principles. What's for sure is that he rejects non-contradiction because he tells you that. Okay? I don't know anywhere where he tells you that he rejects excluded middle, but it might be there as well. I wouldn't, I'd be a bold man to say it's not.
Any further questions? Okay, CY.
So I'm rather interested in your own experience of practicing karate or practicing some kind of Japanese Taekwondo or Kendo or what kind of Budo. That must be some kind of nothingness or some kind of things you might have experienced. So this is something I really wanted to know. But if we refer to the text, I think if I have to limit to one problem in Basho, which I really cannot understand very well, that is the metaphor of mirror, the mirroring of things. And which is actually the topic we discussed last week in the centennial lecture of Basho by Yokhui. But I still cannot really get the very precise things. And that is exactly the central problem also in Chinese Buddhism. So I guess you might have something to say about mirror?
So there are two questions there. The first one is about my experience as a practitioner of karate-do. I have no religion, okay? But I have experienced Mushin in karate-do training. And Mushin is this sort of stream of consciousness. So if that counts, then I have experienced that. But I mean, very briefly and very rarely. The question about the mirror is much more interesting. The mirror is a standard metaphor in Chinese Buddhism. And the point is that something is ultimate reality and it mirrors something and something mirrors it. And sometimes it's put one way, sometimes it's put the other. But Nishida does use, I think he does use the mirror metaphor, and it's closely connected with the seeing language. So he'll say things like ultimate reality, Zetaimu sees itself and it's mirrored in itself. Everything else is mirrored in Zetaimu as well, because it mirrors all its contents. So I think what the mirror image is doing in Nishida is precisely just another way of looking at the seeing metaphor. Zetaimu will see itself because it's in itself.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
Thank you, Professor Priest. I'm thinking read things that we use Z-time rule as a ground, but simultaneously Buddhism is already told us is groundless. How do you think about that? Thank you.
It's been a long 2 weeks, y'all.
Yeah, we're verging on contradiction here, okay? Because remember I told you that Nagarjuna says that emptiness is empty. So even it has no self-being. It is what it is in relation to something else. Now, he doesn't tell you what it is, but the answer that emerges in Chinese Buddhism is that it's empty because being what it is, it relates to conventional reality. So the conventional is what it is by relating to the ultimate is what it is by relating to the conventional. So what's going on there is that what makes Zetai Mu is that it, come back to the mirror metaphor, it mirrors all the things inside it, including itself. But of course it's not in itself, so it can't mirror itself. So it's a resolution of this long-standing tension you get in Buddhism to say that, thank you, it's a groundless ground. Is that a contradiction?
All right, maybe I'll take the pleasure of the last question, because we're almost out of time. Yeah, so thanks so much. I feel like we are led by necessity, as you showed, to contradiction here, and we have to accept it, acknowledge it, come to terms with it. One of my questions first is not about the non-dual so much, but one of the questions we've been dealing with in the summer school, this also came up in Dennis's talk, was given that the non-dual is the ground of all beings, how can there be duality? Or why is there anything dual? Or why is there anything other than just non-duality? And in the Basho, you find some difficult passages where he says things like, beings generated out of nothing, the will generates being out of nothing, and then he'll say things like, free will cannot be rationalized. And you see, like in other texts close by, he'll say things like, ultimately there's a mystical intuition at the ground of things. Beyond language and thought, that tracks your ineffability moment and claim there. So I'm wondering whether you think Nishida has a good answer, at least in this text, for given that non-duality is the contradictory ground of all beings, why there is duality in the first place? Or do you think he's still, that he doesn't really have an answer to this question? So just an open-ended question for you.
Okay. There's a quick answer and a long answer. Let's take the quick answer. Ultimate reality has to be non-dual because that's what the Buddhist texts say. Okay, so that's what he's drawing on. But he has to make sense of this because there is an apparent contradiction because you can predicate things of it. And if you can predicate things of it, you appear to have a duality. So that's to do with the contradictory nature of it being inside itself and not inside itself. Okay, but if you start to explore that further, what you get is the Vimalakirti situation. Because what is it to transcend a duality? So a duality is when you've got a this and a that. Non-duality is, well, transcending the asymmetry. So there's an asymmetry between me and the tree, right? So to transcend an asymmetry, you've got to have a symmetry. And there are two ways of transcending a symmetry, both or neither. Both are ways of transcending duality, but the one you find in Nishida is the both thing. And that's, I think, drawing from the Vimalakirti Sutra.
Well, all right, let's close there. Thanks so much. Let's give Graham a nice round of applause. Okay.
So we have 15 minutes and then our final lecture. So get some coffee or some water.
Thank you. I've laid the ground for you.
Yeah, well, I'm going on a speculative adventure. So.
Okay, great. Welcome back, everyone. It's my great pleasure to join you for the final presentation of what sounds like it's been a very lively and inspiring couple of days, and indeed for many of you, a couple of weeks. And I'll have the pleasure of introducing my colleague, my friend, and one of your co-hosts for these past couple of weeks, and that's Professor Greg Moss. I asked Greg last night if I could just introduce him ad lib, speak from the heart, and present him to you as I see him. And he said, please don't do that, Hayden. And he promptly, you can't trust your friends. And he promptly sent over a detailed bio, so I better stick to the script or else I'm gonna get in trouble here. So Greg Moss is Associate Professor of Philosophy at Chinese University of Hong Kong. Before joining CUHK, he was lecturer in philosophy at Clemson University and awarded his PhD in 2014 from University of Georgia. He completed a Fulbright Research Fellowship in Bonn, Germany in 2013 to 14, where he investigated Schelling's influence on Hegel's doctrine of the concept under Marcus Gabriel. He previously published Hegel's Foundation-Free Metaphysics, The Logic of Singularity, with Routledge in 2020. That was winner of the 2022 Hegel PD Prize. He has edited many volumes, including Mythical Totalities with Moore Ziebeck in 2024, and The Dialectics of Absolute Nothingness, co-edited with Takeshi Murasato, Cornell University Press 2025. He's published a number of articles on the Kyoto School, including articles on Nishida, Tanabe, Nishitani, and Ueda. He has also translated 2 works from German into English, including Marcus Gabriel's Why the World Does Not Exist, 2015, and Ueda Shitsuteru's Meister Eckhart's Mysticism in Comparison with Zen Buddhism from 2022. His most recent book, Absolute Dialetheism, Hegel, Schelling, and the End of Alterity, was just published in the new Perspectives in Ontology series with Edinburgh University Press 2026. There's the book, do take a look, congratulations. And he is currently completing a book for the Cambridge Elements series entitled Hegel and Nishida. Please join me in welcoming Professor Greg Moss.
Okay, so now you know something about me. Okay, so instead of doing a historical reconstruction of Nishida's ideas, my aim today is to articulate the place of Nishida in my own thinking now. So the idea was to end the conference by thinking about the relevance of Nishida for contemporary philosophy. And so I will speak about Nishida, but from the place of my own thinking. Okay? So you'll see Nishida showing up throughout the lecture. Okay. The task of philosophy, as Fichte so eloquently articulated it in his 1804 Science of Knowing, consists in the presentation of the absolute. Fichte echoes Hegel, for whom God is the one and only object of philosophy. According to the phenomenology, the absolute is the one and only truth. The absolute alone is true, or the truth alone is absolute. Nishida follows the idealist, for he declares that, quote, truth is singular, close quote. And from its earliest beginnings, Western philosophy has concerned itself with everything. Thales famously proclaimed that everything is water. It may seem that today we are very far from Thales. However, are we so far from him today? In order to know that it is true that everything is water, one must conceive everything as water. But what is a concept? The concept of water is not itself water. Thales' view cannot account for the existence of his knowledge that everything is water. And contemporary forms of naive ontological naturalism make the same mistake. Naive naturalism treats empirical concepts as absolute. Empirical concepts are not absolute concepts, for they do not apply to themselves. The concept of $100 is not itself $100. The concept of water does not itself have the properties of water. It is not self-referential. It is not an instance of itself. In order to know the absolute, we cannot rely upon empirical concepts alone. Empirical concepts have their origin in perceptual experience. And because empirical concepts are derived from experience, their incompleteness can be discerned in perceptual experience itself. As Wittgenstein noted, the visual perception does not see the eye, quote, but you do not really see the eye, and from nothing in the field of sight can it be concluded that it is seen from an eye. Visual perception does not see its own act of perceiving, It is only because it is blind to itself that it sees anything else. Purification in dialectics. How can philosophy present the absolute in concepts? Hegel teaches us that absolute knowledge demands complete detachment from perceptual experience. Plato calls upon the philosopher to practice for dying and being dead. And I'm also advocating for this. Only by detaching from the body and the senses can absolute knowledge be achieved. The imagination, too, depends upon perceptual experience for its content. Thus, one should not ignore Meister Eckhart's call to embrace a radical Abgeschiedenheit from all images, for only thereby can one approach God, the Hen Kaipan. As Plato says, the pure is revealed only to the pure. One of the great achievements of Hegel's phenomenology of spirit is that it shows that any attempt to relativize conceptual knowing only absolutizes it. By limiting conceptual knowing to representations of a knowing subject and opposing it to an object that transcends it, the object is conceived as something non-conceptual. However, the claim that the object is independent of conceptual knowing renders it conceptual. Every conception of the independent object as non-conceptual is only a further conceptualization of the object. Thus, the knowing subject learns that the concept is all-encompassing. It is instantiated both in the subject and the object of its knowing. In the final analysis, this cannot be an indirect knowing, for there is nothing that transcends the field of conceptual mediation. The conceptual knowledge that conceptual form has no limits demands direct self-knowledge. The philosopher can only draw such a limit to the concept by exceeding the limit, and by purifying conceptual thought from all non-conceptual foundations. Conceptual thinking no longer depends upon something other than itself for its justification, but it can only rely upon itself. And since freedom is nothing other than self-determination, purifying philosophy of all foundations engenders the absolute freedom of conceptual thought. The meaning of existence. Nothing can exist unless it instantiates a universal. If I discover a counterexample to the principle that what exists must instantiate a universal, something would exist that does not instantiate a universal. However, the counterexample still instantiates a universal, the universal being, for the counterexample has some being. It is not nothing. And what is more, the counterexample will be further distinguished from everything that does not instantiate universals. As such, the counterexample will also instantiate the concept of negation. Instantiation is the particularization of the universal, and as a result, every particular depends upon the existence of universals. On the one hand, the particulars must be conceptually determined, and this is impossible without universals. On the other hand, since nothing exists that does not instantiate a universal, if there were only universals and no particulars, the universals would not exist, for all universals are particulars that instantiate the concept of universality itself. Thus, existence is never merely universal nor particular, but whatever exists is always already both. Because singularity, Einzelheit, expresses the unity of the universal and the particular, whatever exists is singular. Existence is singularity. Since universals, too, only exist if they instantiate a universal, every particular depends upon the existence of universals that are also particulars. And because Einzelheit, or singularity, expresses the unity of the universal and the particular, the universal does not exist unless it is also singular. If truth is the correspondence of the concept with being, truth is obtained when the concept matches the being. And were existence totally transconceptual, no philosophical concept could in principle correspond to what exists. And philosophy would fail to match its concept with what exists. For instance, the judgment, Socrates is human, can only be true if the concept of humanity is actually realized in Socrates himself. And because existence has the form of singularity, the form of the judgment, the particular is universal, expresses the true form of existence in thought. In the issue of consciousness, Nishida already had the germ of this idea, quoting him, rather than saying that thought is within us, we should say that we are in thought, close quote. In other Nishidan terms, everything that exists is emplaced in a basho, to follow Graham. As Nishida writes, that which is must be emplaced in something, and logically the universal serves as its basho, close quote. Thus, that which is must be emplaced in the universal. And only because entities are emplaced within a conceptually determinate domain is it possible for the concepts in our judgments to correspond to the conceptual structure of those domains. Does the complete and organized totality of beings exist? Does the world itself exist? Are there any absolute universals that apply to everything? Marcus Gabriel in Fields of Sense and Elaine Badiou in Being an Event declare that it cannot exist. However, the position that the absolute does not exist is false. The class of beings would be incomplete if there were some being that did not belong to the class of beings. But if this were true, then there would be some being that existed outside the class of beings. And in this case, this being would no longer be outside the class, for it is a being and would thereby belong to the class. Thus, it is impossible to find anything that would render the class of beings incomplete. There is nothing outside the class of beings, for whatever is outside is also inside, such that the totality of beings must be. And if anything exists at all, the class of existence must be complete. The world is, in sum, nothing other than the organized totality that instantiates the concept of being. Having purified oneself of all relative knowing, one can finally resolve to think absolute being. And dialectics is the philosophical method by which the absolute, or the world, is known. If the absolute is the end of philosophical knowledge, speculative dialectics is the means. In order to know the world, dialectical thinking employs concepts that apply to everything, including itself. Having liberated oneself from everything relative and incomplete, what remains? All that remains is to think what is left, the absolute, what is relative to nothing. Abstraction reveals a concept of absolute existence, existence without further qualification, Sein, reines Sein. The concept of being is the unity of all beings insofar as it expresses that in virtue of which each being is a member of the totality of everything that exists. And with the question, what is being, the questioner investigates the predicate that would distinguish being, what it is that would set being apart from beings. To answer the question, we must declare that being is such and such. Being does not differentiate between any beings. To proclaim that a being is does not differentiate it from another being that is. Being does not introduce any differentiation into the field of being, and thus being is indistinct, non-dual. Dialectics is a form of conceptual thinking in which one conceives everything by means of self-referential concepts. In order to be absolute, the concept must apply to itself. Otherwise, it would be a merely relative concept. And since being is an absolute concept, it must be self-referential. Being itself has being, and for this reason, it must be an instance of itself. Being is a being. When we ask what is being, we are really asking what is the being of being. The question itself cannot be asked without self-referential predication. Being is a being. The concept of undifferentiated being immediately negates itself. Each being is a being, this or that being. Each is a particular being that is distinct from and relative to the others. And because all other beings are only individual, because they are differentiated from each other, the concept of indistinction specifies the way that being is different from all other beings. The concept of absolute indistinction differentiates being from all relative or differentiated beings. As a result, being is one differentiated being among others, since it is different from all differentiated beings in virtue of its indistinct character. The self-referential character of being engenders existential implication. Because the concept of being is absolute, the concept applies to itself. And since being applies to itself, being must fall within its own class. Being must instantiate being. And as an instance of being, being is a particular being, this being. Following Nishida's self-determining predicate, or universal, we discover that the concept of being exists in virtue of itself. Quoting Nishida, the self-determining universal, by possessing itself in self-negation, in parentheses self-expression, becomes a grammatical subject, close quote. Dialectics teaches us that absolute concepts are existentially implicative, and absolute concepts are not merely possibilities to be. They are self-realizing possibilities, such that, citing Nishida, quoting him, the universal is its own process of particularization, close quote. Or as he puts it in Logic and Life, quote, that the universal determines itself means that it individuates itself, close quote. And since to exist is to instantiate a universal, and being is an instance of itself, it follows that being exists. Because it is an absolute concept, it must be self-predicative and exist in virtue of itself. Being is singular, for it is both universal and particular, singularity, but it has its particularity in virtue of itself, not in virtue of something else. And since it is particular in virtue of its own universality, being is self-singularizing. Being must exist. It exists in virtue of itself, the absolute idea. In sum, the world is the organized totality of beings, the absolute unity in which everything exists. And absolute concepts are self-predicative existentially implicative, and self-realizing possibilities. Being is also the totality of all beings or the world itself. Since the distinguishing feature of being is its indistinctness, and since we can quantify over all beings, being itself cannot be distinct from any being. Because it is indistinct, it cannot be distinct from any being. Those of you in the summer school have heard me say this a few times. Because being is indistinct from every being, being has no limit and must be infinite. Being is the absolutely unlimited totality. The unlimited totality is not relative to anything else, for everything falls within it. Thus, in this way too, being is the absolute, for it is just as much the totality as the whole itself. As indistinct, being expresses itself in all particular beings, such that the world cannot be differentiated from the concept upon which it depends. The world is being insofar as it has differentiated itself. It is the Henkaipan, the one and only, the free and singular absolute. The term absolute captures both the conceptual aspect of the Henkaipan and its status as a being. First, absolute is a predicate, which applies to concepts. Being is absolute. But we nominalize this predicate because the absolute is not just a property of a concept, but exists as one being among others, and is coexistent or coextensive with the world whole. To conclude, the absolute is the absolute idea, the unconditioned universal that all beings have in common, one particular being among many, and the singular totality of all things. The absolute is the one and all. And with this insight, we are brought to the threshold of Eckhart's insight that, quote, God is free of all things, and therefore God is all things. Cusanus too knows that God is, quote, in all things in all things, and yet remains absolute or separate from them all, close quote. Okay, the ontological argument. The existence of the absolute is established by means of existentially implicative concepts, and such concepts exist in virtue of themselves alone. And since the ontological argument is a form of proof whereby the concept alone is sufficient to infer its existence, one might object that the dialectical argument for the existence of the absolute depends upon the ontological argument. As Hegel points out in his Science of Logic, Kant's argument against the ontological argument equivocates on absolute and empirical concepts. Kant's critique of the ontological argument measures the existence of an absolute concept, that is the absolute, by appealing to the truth conditions of empirical notions like $100. By measuring absolute concepts by the structure of relative ones, Kant unknowingly equivocates on different forms of universality. From Thales to Kant, philosophers make the same mistake again and again. We model our concept of the absolute on what is relative. Descartes was right. We cannot think of God as not existing. Either we are thinking of God existing, or we are not thinking of God at all. As Hegel says, quote, the concept of God realizes itself most fully as this universal that determines and particularizes itself, close quote. The critiques of the ontological argument from Aquinas to Schelling usually reformulate the proof as hypothetical. If God exists, then God is the being whose essence is to exist. The hypothetical reformulation is tantamount to a denial of the existence of absolute concepts. Are all concepts merely relative to existence conditions that transcend them? If nothing exists that does not instantiate a universal, this isn't the case, for nothing exceeds the form of the concept. And if the form of conceptuality is coextensive with being, the form of universality and the concept of being are absolute. Thus, there are absolute concepts whose existence conditions cannot exceed them, since nothing exceeds them. In short, one cannot absolutize the distinction between concept and existence without compromising the singular and conceptual form of the absolute. To quote Spinoza, whatever is in God, and nothing can exist or be conceived without God, close quote. Following the trends set by Badiou and Gabriel, Robert Pippin has recently declared that Heidegger is right. He says, there is no absolute, there cannot be an absolute. But Pippin is wrong. There is the absolute, and there must be an absolute. Against all Kantian or positivist protestations, Nishida, from pure experience to the logic of contradictory identity, teaches us that the absolute must appear. Nishida's philosophy attempts to fulfill Fichte's call to present the absolute. The question is not whether the absolute appears, but how it appears. That's the question. Okay, absolute dialetheism. The absolute is contradictory. And dialectics can achieve absolute knowledge by employing self-referential concepts that are existentially implicative. But as Kant taught us, absolute knowledge comes at a high cost. Well, for some of you, for me, it's not a cost at all. This is free. Consistency. Dialectical knowledge is inherently contradictory. Nishida is on point that, quote, a true logic must adequately exhibit the self-expression of the absolute, and therefore it must be paradoxical, close quote. Consider the concept of the absolute itself. Everything that is relative exists in relation to something else that transcends it. Everything that is relative excludes something. And since the absolute excludes nothing, the absolute cannot be relative. On the other hand, if the absolute were simply other than what is relative, it would not be absolute. If the absolute were other to what is relative, it would exclude something and would itself be relative. Hence, in order to be absolute, the absolute must itself be relative or non-absolute. The singularity of the absolute is a contradictory singularity. For universals that are particulars of another universal, the universal can be universal and particular in different respects. Unlike concepts like mammal, absolute concepts like being are universal and particular in the same respect. They are particulars in virtue of their very universality. The absolute is absolutely nothing in the sense that the absolute universal is self-negating. It is not what it is in virtue of its very being. Right? It is particular in virtue of its universality. We can identify discrete and interconnected principles of one dialectical method: self-reference, self-negation, and self-expression or existential implication. Being itself has being, and in virtue of that self-predication, being itself must be a being. And as a result, the universal is self-negating. The universal being stands in contradiction with itself. In virtue of negating itself, it particularizes itself as a being. As Nishida teaches us, quoting him, because God or the absolute stands to itself in the form of a contradictory identity, namely as its own absolute self-negation, or as possessing absolute self-negation within itself, it exists and expresses itself through itself, close quote. The absolute exists in virtue of itself, and it can only appear in contradictory form. Absolute dialetheism is the view that the absolute exists, but with the qualification that the absolute exists is a true contradiction. Absolute dialetheism does not affirm that every contradiction is true, only that there are no consistent worldviews. If the absolute is a true contradiction, and we follow the traditional understanding of conceptual knowledge, whereby there cannot be true contradictions, then this truth must be a trans-conceptual truth. Using priest language, I have called this position a mystical dialetheism. Graham doesn't talk about mysticism, but the dialetheism part, according to which the absolute is a true contradiction, but cannot be successfully articulated via concepts. There is another species of absolute dialetheism that I call rational dialetheism, which is the view that the absolute is intrinsically conceptual. And according to this view, the absolute can be successfully presented via concepts. Having demonstrated the absoluteness of the concept, rational dialetheism appears to be true. Okay, so everything looks tidy, but now let's get things untidy. The limits of rational dialetheism. So this is me staying in my lane. By thinking rational dialetheism through to its limits, we discover that by itself, it cannot constitute absolute knowledge. Because Nishida's concept is such that the universal is that which determines and particularizes itself, those are his words, it is existentially implicative and thereby relativizes the absolute. The absolute can only be absolute if it negates itself as absolute and thereby determines itself to be relative. If it exists outside of itself and äußerung. The absolute can only exist if it is alienated from its being. Being effaces itself for the finitude of beings. The self-externality of Nishida's concept demonstrates that formal logic has a place within the absolute. Otherwise, it cannot be the concrete universal we claim it to be. And because the concept is self-differentiating, it determines itself to be non-conceptual. Hegel's Lehre vom Begriff teaches that, quote, in this universality, the concept is outside of itself, close quote. The concept realizes itself as singularity only to lose its very conceptual being. Quoting Hegel, singularity is not only the turning back of the concept into itself, but the immediate loss of it, close quote. The absolute is self-relativizing. This means that it must determine itself to be relative. And if the absolute really is a true contradiction, and the concept is the absolute, then the absolute should be equally non-conceptual. It is one-sided only to emphasize the conceptual aspect of truth. To the contrary, on its own terms, that which transcends the concept ought to have an equal place in the formulation of absolute truth. Singularity itself demands that the non-conceptual be given an equal place. The concept of the absolute is not relative to anything, and for this reason, it cannot be relative to relative being. And thus, the concept of the absolute must itself be relative. And since the concept of the absolute is relative, and the relative is not absolute, the concept of the absolute is not absolute. The concept reveals that it is not sufficient to circumscribe the absolute, and reveals that the concept of the absolute is divorced from the absolute itself. Conceptual knowing parts ways with the absolute itself. The self-realizing and absolute concept with which our inquiry began must be set to one side. A finite being among others, it is relativized, and as such, it is an insufficient reconstruction of the totality that exceeds it, to which it no longer corresponds. And since this concept of the absolute is relative, and the relative is indebted to a principle of existence that exists outside of it, the concept of the absolute is indebted to a principle of existence that transcends it. The concept of the absolute determines itself to have relative form. It must take on the very incompleteness that its concept negates. Relative concepts, such as formal and empirical ones, have their principle of existence outside themselves. And so too now does the absolute. Qua absolute, the concept is its own principle of existence. But since it must determine itself to be relative, it must determine itself not to be its own principle of existence. And as relative, the concept of the absolute now must depend upon a non-conceptual principle of existence in virtue of which it exists. As relative, without the external principle of existence, the concept as such, or the absolute concept, would not be. And because the absolute determines itself to be transconceptual, it thereby relativizes all concepts, rendering their origin inscrutable and contingent. For each being now is without Y, or each concept is without Y. The absolute concept expresses itself in the form of its negation as the contingent, as that whose origin cannot be explicated and remains without explication. The absolute determines itself to exist as that which contains concepts that are without Y. And since even the absolute concept as such must exist in virtue of something else, the principle of existence is not itself a concept. The particularization of the concept, its existence, has its origin in what is not a concept. And as a result, the dialectics of absolute concept demonstrate that the concept is not the sole element of truth, like Hegel said. Conceptual thought impurifies itself, positing itself on one side as the incomplete that exists in virtue of what is transconceptual. So this is a critique of Hegel, actually. The absolute must transcend every concept of the absolute, for every concept of the absolute must relativize itself. And as a result, the absolute must be transconceptual, and a transconceptual principle of existence in virtue of which the concept exists, in virtue of which the concept of the absolute exists. Every concept depends upon this transconceptual for its existence. The transconceptual is absolute. But the absolute is completely unique, for there is only one absolute. As Rosenzweig teaches us, three alls are unthinkable. There is one and only one all. It is non-repeatable. This is the only lesson I got from Rosenzweig. I tried, but this is the only lesson that I received here. The self-referential power of the absolute concept nullifies its conceptuality, posits itself as transconceptual. For the one and only absolute singularity, the conceptual exists in the form of the transconceptual. So our initial reflections in which we emphasized the conceptuality of the absolute were one-sided. In order to fully think through the dialectic absolute, we are called to consider the transconceptual principle upon which all conceptual thinking depends. Citing Schelling, there is obviously something other and something more than mere reason in the world, close quote. Okay, now to mystical dialectism. Having purified thought of everything transconceptual, thought must again purify itself of this act of purification. Thought must purify itself of all conceptual content. And because the absolute transcends the concept, so must our knowing of the absolute transcend the concept. Philosophy can only know the absolute if philosophy transforms itself into religion. So it's the defense of religion. Since the absolute exceeds all concepts, the practice by which the absolute is revealed must be a non-conceptual attentiveness to the absolute. Since such a consciousness does not draw any conceptual distinction, it does not draw a conceptual distinction between itself and the absolute. This is nothing but mysticism, for mysticism is the non-conceptual experience of the absolute in which one is the absolute that one knows. As Nishida observes, religious consciousness can resolve the problem of self-contradiction, if you look at it as a problem, by ceasing to conceive altogether. This absolute consciousness is religious in the mystical sense. By purifying our thinking of all mediating factors, images, concepts, etc., we experience the absolute directly or immediately. Our reflections began from the affirmation of a dialectical logic of self-reference. And because this dialectical logic of self-reference already engenders the truth of some contradictions, the mysticism developed here has its source in a logic of self-contradiction. This is very important. The dialectical method operates by determinate negation in the sense developed by Hegel in his phenomenology and further developed by Nishida in his late philosophy. Dialectical contradictions do not operate according to the principle of explosion, but the contradictions that are created from the dialectic of absolute nothingness have specific results. The self-negation of the absolute concept produces the relative absolute, and through its self-referential predication, the absolute concept negates itself and determines itself to be the relative absolute. Being is an absolute concept, and as such it is self-referential. The self-referential structure implies existential implication, and this existential implication further entails that the concept is not absolute but relative. And this is a contradiction, but from this contradiction we do not infer that all distinctions collapse or that any proposition can be true. The relativity of the absolute is the specific negation of the absolute into which the absolute concept has transformed itself as the relative absolute. The specific content of the relative absolute lies in the fact that it has its principle of existence outside of itself. By negating itself through this self-contradiction, the concept of the existentially implicative absolute determines itself to be relative, so that the concept of the absolute must have its existence outside of itself. Thus, mystical dialectism, which affirms this result and takes it as its starting point, belongs to the very dialectical sequence of philosophical thought, for it is merely the consequence of the determinate self-negation engendered by absolute thinking. So the split between the concept of the absolute and the absolute is itself the very specific result of the dialectical process of this self-contradiction. So the claim is it's not explosive. The conceptual absolute negates itself and posits itself as relative, thereby raising its negation, the non-conceptual absolute, to the throne of the absolute. And exactly because the concept of the absolute exists in the form of self-contradiction, its self-contradictory form must contradict itself, thereby determining itself to be consistent. Insofar as the concept of the absolute is consistent, it cannot admit its negation. However, the concept can only be absolute if it is not other to what is relative. And since every categorization of the absolute leads to contradiction, the concept of the absolute negates its own claim to absoluteness. Through the experience of the self-destruction of the concept of the absolute, the philosopher experiences the transconceptual as the absolute, the truth of which cannot be conceived. As Nishida has taught us, there is, quote, a mystical reality that is always hidden at the base of thought, close quote, a reality accessible by, quoting him, a mystical intuition, close quote. The ultimate truth is, and again quoting him, an infinite mystery. Through the self-relativizing of all concepts of the absolute, the philosopher fails to conceptualize it. The concept of the absolute relativizes itself, thereby losing its unconditioned status. And for this reason, all that is required for mystical experience is the experience of the self-falsification of the concept of the relative absolute, in virtue of which the philosopher can witness and give witness to the absolute as non-conceptual. So there's a Tanabe reference. Witness is also the sense of experience, but also testify to. Give testimony. With the revenge of consistency, no concept can live up to the absolute. Accordingly, in the experience of the contradiction, the philosopher experiences that which transcends all conceptual distinctions. The absolute is conceptually indistinct. And since the absolute transcends all conceptual distinctions, the thinker cannot conceptually distinguish the absolute from their own consciousness of the absolute. So through this experience of the transconceptual absolute, the philosopher or the philosophical subject experiences the absolute as personal. For there is no conceptual difference between the human subject and the absolute with whom they are identified. Thus, in this pure experience of thinking, to use Nishida's term, in which subject and object are indistinct from one another, the absolute reveals itself as the infinite and unconditioned personality, or what is the same as God. Falling into pure indistinction, the philosopher cannot find where they end and God begins. In the indistinction of contradiction, the philosopher celebrates the mystical absolute, the birth of Christ in the soul, the infinite personality. Nishida is right that God is known directly. Quoting Nishida, how can we verify the existence of God in our direct experience? An infinite power is hidden even in our small chests that are restricted by time and space. The infinite unifying power of reality is latent in us. We can know the foundation of reality that forms the universe in the depths of our hearts. We can grasp the true face of God. The unifying, free activity of the human heart proves God directly, close quote. Okay. Exactly because the absolute transcends the structure of the concept, the mystical view affirms the contradiction as true. The contradiction is true, for it reveals all concepts to be relative and to exist in virtue of a transconceptual principle. In mystical dialechism, the truth of the contradiction lies in the way that it reveals the absolute to be the other power, the power other to discursive reason, in virtue of which any concept can exist. The failure of the concept shows what cannot be said, and here truth no longer operates as correspondence of concept with its object, as it did at the beginning of our talk, but it's something more like Heidegger's transconceptual disclosure or aletheia. In mystical dialechism, existence is that which stands out, the thatness which resists our efforts to conceptualize it by any whatness. In mystical dialechism, pure existence is immediately experienced in the ecstatic self-transcendence of categorical thought. Mystical dialechism transcends the vision of existence proffered in rational dialechism. Now, if we characterize the concept as the mediated relation to an object as Kant defined it, the overcoming of the conceptual relation of the object places the mystic in an immediate relation to the object. Again, to cite Kant, the immediate relation here to an object would be an intuition. Thus, in mystical dialechism, the absolute is revealed in intuition. Of course, Kant wouldn't like this, but I'm just using his formally definition of intuition. And since it is only by means of reason and its failure that there is the event, Ereignis, of absolute revelation, the intuition is intellectual. In mystical knowing, being is revealed as existence only because discursive reason becomes an intellectual intuiting. Following Nishida again, quoting him, intellectual intuition, what is it? He says, the unifying activity in pure experience, close quote, in which there is, quoting him, a oneness of subject and object, close quote. Intellectual intuition, in other words, is nous, the immediate contemplation of existence itself. Mystical dialechism is a form of rationalism, I would contend, for it is nous by which totality is grasped. The truth that constitutes nous is the revelation of the absolute as contradiction. The method is totally, I hold, exoteric and available to any and all. Although people can't witness or testify for you, the process by which that witnessing is made possible, I think, is exoteric. Okay, so now you're worried about me. Don't worry. We're going to come back to philosophy now. Given that in mystical dialechism, the transconceptual is absolute, the transconceptual appears to exist by itself so that mystical truth is the transconceptual self-correspondence of the absolute with itself. And by itself, the mystical absolute is one-sided, for it excludes the truth of conceptual cognition. And since there is no true concept that corresponds with the transconceptual absolute, in the transconceptual experience of the absolute, one transcends all conceptual differences. But by transcending all concepts in the transconceptual experience of the absolute, one must also transcend the very transcending of concepts. More simply put, since all conceptual differences disappear in the transconceptual experience, there cannot be any conceptual difference between the concept and the absolute. And hence, in the transconceptual experience of the absolute, one experiences the indistinguishability of the conceiving from the non-conceiving, from the concept and the non-conceptual absolute. Ironically, the transconceptual knowledge of the absolute is a completely conceptual experience. In virtue of the transconceptual experience itself, one ought to recognize absolute truth as the self-correspondence of the concept with itself. Thus, in virtue of mystical dialechism, the transconceptual thinking of the absolute cancels itself as purely transconceptual and is preserved in rational dialechism. Because the transconceptual experience of the absolute transforms itself into an absolutely conceptual experience, one can know the absolute conceptually by matching the concept of self-contradiction in thought with the same concept of self-contradiction that is instantiated in the absolute itself. The mystic inadvertently demonstrates the pervasive and universal presence of the same concept of contradiction in the absolute itself. And since the absolute itself is contradictory, conceiving the absolute as contradictory is no longer a failure, but a success. The result of this process, rational dialethism, is not just a reiteration, for it now appears as a result. The inquiry has formed a circle. Rational dialethism negates itself, thereby giving rise to mystical dialethism, whose self-negation transforms itself again into rational dialethism. The dialectical logic of the absolute progresses by moving through stages, from the rational to the mystical and back again. The circular turn, the realized nostalgia, satiates the spirit. Thinking with Proclus, I think this is just Neoplatonism, that wouldn't be wrong. There is a twofold process of dispersing from the one and gathering back into it. The concept empties itself, kenosis, of its conceptuality, only to return to it again to its conceptual origin. Absolute singularity is true to itself when it is self-singularizing. The power of self-universalization corresponds with the power of self-particularization. Because the mystical and the conceptual lead to each other, should not the truth of the absolute be affirmed by taking both paths? As we've demonstrated, the absolute must be both conceptual and transconceptual, just as the concept must be both absolute and relative. And if absolute knowledge is inherently self-contradictory, the knowledge that the absolute is conceptual should imply that the absolute is also non-conceptual, and vice versa. Knowing that the absolute is transconceptual ought to imply that the absolute is conceptual. And the rational, conceptual, and mystical or non-conceptual forms of absolute dialethism appear to be equally true. The absolute is both conceptual and non-conceptual in form. Quoting Nishida, the word of God is something rational, a logos, and yet what is trans-rational and irrational is also equally expressed by it, close quote. I wouldn't exactly put it in those terms, but it's close enough. Or again, it is not the case, this is quoting Nishida, therefore, that the creative, salvific, and revealing word, the principle of the absurd, is merely trans-rational or irrational. As the self-expression of the absolute, it authenticates our true self, and it makes reason to be true reason, close quote. So I think this is what Nishida means, and I have a hard time distinguishing my own thinking from his here. So maybe you can tell me what the difference is, and this would be helpful, okay? Nishida is not in the title of the book, but he's everywhere. I didn't reify him in the title. The publisher demanded names, so I put the names people expect from me. My term philosophical religion connotes just this dialectic process of knowing the absolute in its two-sidedness. Philosophical religion marks the intersection of reason and mysticism, the conscious point at which intuition becomes conceptual and the conceptual becomes intuitive, the point where the intuition of God becomes a conceiving of God. On the one hand, in any act of self-consciousness, consciousness is its own object, for it is aware of itself. Accordingly, in self-consciousness, the object must be indistinct from the subjective act by which it is conceived. And since intuition is the indistinction of subject and object, self-consciousness is always intuitive in form. On the other hand, the self-negation of the purely intuitive relation we have in religion engenders a break between consciousness and its object, such that by conceptualizing itself, the absolute negates the identity of consciousness and its object. Just as the phenomenologist's eidetic variations demonstrate, the act by which the subject conceives is distinct from the object conceived. I can keep the conceptual consciousness the same, yet vary the object conceived. Accordingly, conceptual self-consciousness always invokes a distinction between the subject and the object of conception. In any instance of conceptual self-consciousness, whether it be absolute or relative, the act of conceiving must be distinct from the object conceived. However, since every act of self-consciousness is a form of intuition, whereby subject is the object, conceptual self-consciousness too must also be a form of intuition. And yet, conceptual self-consciousness is not intuitive, for it distinguishes the subject from the object. Thus, any successful instance of conceptual self-consciousness must always be a contradictory unity of intuition and conception. By successfully conceiving oneself, the subject is indistinct from the object, and this is intuition. But conceptual self-consciousness requires that the subject also be distinct from the object, for conceptual self-consciousness always implies the distinction between these two. Thus, Nishida holds that conceptual self-consciousness is contradictory. Quoting him, therefore, that which contradicts itself must always be what is self-aware, must be what is as self-aware being, close quote. In sum, self-conception requires both that the object be distinct from the subject, otherwise it is not conceptual, and that the object be identical to the subject, otherwise it is not a consciousness of itself. Conceptual self-consciousness is the unity of intuition and the concept. On the one hand, religion is the practice of intuiting the absolute, while philosophy is the practice of conceiving it. And as a result, absolute self-conception would be constituted by the unity of philosophy and religion, what I call philosophical religion. By contradicting itself, the absolute exhibits self-reference. The absolute maintains itself in virtue of its very self-contradictory form. By contradicting itself, self-contradiction is consistent with its form and thereby true to its contradictory form. By not contradicting itself, self-contradiction contradicts itself and thereby remains true to itself. In every self-relation to itself, it remains true to itself. The absolute is at one with itself in its very contradiction. Again, citing Nishida. In what sense, then, is the absolute the true absolute? It is truly absolute by being opposed to nothing. It is absolute being only if it is opposed to nothing. And since there can be nothing at all that objectively opposes the absolute must relate to itself as a form of self-contradiction. It must express itself by negating itself, and by negating itself, it is paradoxically one with itself, close quote. Because the absolute is just as much transconceptual as it is conceptual, each form of absolute knowledge should give rise to the other. The mystical transforms itself into the rational and vice versa. And in every oscillation between the rational and the mystical, one and the same structure is realized and infinitely repeated. Self-contradiction. Philosophy is completed, or the philosophical knowing of the absolute is completed in an infinite self-repetition of the principle of self-contradiction. And since conceptual knowledge of the absolute is only true to itself in the religious experience of the absolute, and the religious experience of the absolute is only true to itself in the conceptual knowing of the absolute, true religion is philosophical and true philosophy is religious. Using Nishida's terminology, philosophical religion is a pure experience of absolute thinking. And such a pure experience is, to use another contradictory phrase, a non-intuitive intuition. Being lost in the conceiving of the absolute concept itself, the self-contradiction, intuitively appears as the one and all. And for this reason, one can also speak of a non-conceptual conceiving. By intuiting the absolute in the experience of contradiction in religious practice, I conceive the absolute contradiction, and in my act of conceiving the absolute contradiction, I intellectually intuit the presence of God. Absolute dialetheism calls for the contradictory self-identity of religion and philosophy. And absolute dialetheism has its highest expression in the practice of philosophical religion. The absolute is the true infinite. It is not incomplete. And absolute knowing oscillates from rationalism to mysticism and back again. Accordingly, the process of knowing is constituted by the same oscillating form that is distinctive of the bad infinite. But with the insight that the mystical is rational and the rational mystical, we see the true infinite. This is philosophical religion, the constant and all-pervasive truth of the unity of the mystical and rational dialetheism that pervade each act by which the absolute is known. The process of self-absolutization and self-relativization never ends, but each new iteration of the process is an infinite repetition of the same absolute and contradictory universal. Philosophical religion is the true infinite that exists in human knowing, the true infinite that has realized itself in human knowledge, what Nishitani calls the real self-awareness of reality. And because the absolute is truly absolute in philosophical religion, the intuitive understanding that constitutes philosophical religion intuits the absolute in virtue of thinking it. And since the absolute is not truly absolute without existing in philosophical religion, which is a form of human knowing, the intuitive understanding of the absolute gives the absolute a new authentic existence. In philosophical religion, it is not alienated from its absoluteness. In the night, when all cows are black, in the absolute nothingness of mystical dialetheism, the pistol shot, total indistinction reigns. This is an unbounded contradiction in which the soul and the fly are equal. And yet, exactly because it is nothing, there is nothing that can stand against the dialectical logic, the logic that produces specific results by self-predication and existential implication. Thus, the unbounded contradiction of mystical dialetheism allows and enables the dialectical logic to be, and to operate autonomously and absolutely. By looking into the depths of the unbounded and indistinct contradiction, one finds the restricted economy of dialectical logic. By operating absolutely, dialectical logic produces, via self-negation, the unbounded contradiction in which mystical dialetism subsists. To be sure, the unbounded and indistinct contradiction endemic to mystical dialetism itself appears as a specific result of the absolute dialectical logic. It is an element of that dialectical logic. The indeterminate contradiction of mystical dialetism is cancelled and preserved as an element within the restricted economy of rational dialetism itself. Okay, the self-idealization of the absolute. How is it possible for the philosopher who operates with concepts to know this autonomous process of self-universalization, in virtue of which the absolute exists? Since this transformation from mystical to rational dialetism is not only a transformation of our knowing, but also a transformation of the very being of the absolute, in the darkest night of the soul, where all conceptual distinctions vanish, we experience the self-conceptualization of the absolute itself. In virtue of intellectually intuiting being, the thinker witnesses the self-universalization of the absolute, in virtue of which the absolute itself exists in conceptual form. As Nishida puts it, the philosopher must experience, quoting him, the rationalization of that which is absolutely irrational, close quote, so that the absolute rationalizes itself, thereby making itself amenable to rational explication. And since it is the transconceptual that has determined itself to be conceptual, the absolute exists as a unity of the transconceptual with the conceptual. The transconceptual exists as conceptual, and philosophical religion knows the absolute insofar as it exists, insofar as it is the one and only singularity. Because the absolute immediately conceptualizes itself, it negates this neither nor structure and posits itself in the form of the both and. It is both conceptual and transconceptual, the self-contradictory totality. And thus the transition from mystical to rational dialetism teaches us that the absolute is self-idealizing. It categorizes itself, and that self-idealization enables the absolute to be idealized by philosophical consciousness. We do not conceptualize the absolute because we resolve to. We conceptualize it even though we may not want to, or even if we want to stay in this mystical position, it seems impossible. Nishida himself declares that knowledge of the absolute is a pure intuiting. The absolute beginning, whether it be epistemic or ontological, must be immediate, and that immediacy can only be known via an intellectual intuition. And because the absolute determines itself to be conceptually mediated, the absolute can be grasped by means of concepts. Thus, philosophers can access the absolute by means of concepts too. And because rational dialetism is true, the concept of self-contradiction that exists in the thought of the philosopher corresponds with the being of the absolute itself. Given that the absolute conceptualizes itself, the very transition from absolute indistinction to conceptual self-mediation is conceptually accessible and should have a conceptual articulation. And so the philosopher is justified in conceptually describing exactly what transpires from the mystical to the rational, exactly because the absolute has determined itself to be conceptually mediated. We are emboldened to explicitly take up the position of rational dialetism and describe the self-determination of the absolute from the standpoint of the absolute that is saturated in conceptual content. Having justified rational dialetism, we are now justified in our presentation of the absolute as a self-determining conceptual process. And the ontological argument is hereby justified, and we return to the conceptual formulation of the absolute with which we began. Our philosophical articulation of the ontological argument generates a second conceptual series within the absolute itself. The transconceptual absolute makes itself vanish, and through canceling itself, the transconceptual absolute determines itself to be conceptual. The concept of the absolute achieves its truth, its correspondence with the absolute, in virtue of the transconceptual absolute canceling and preserving itself in conceptual form. By conceptualizing itself, the absolute determines itself to be both conceptual and non-conceptual, and Nishida's absolute nothingness perfectly exemplifies this self-contradiction. For the absolute instantiates no concept, and as such, it is absolutely nothing. Quoting him, the absolute must rather possess self-negation within itself, and in this respect, the absolute must be absolutely nothing, close quote. But by conceptualizing itself, absolute nothingness conceptualizes itself as the concept that is the absence of all concepts, where to be is not to be. The absolute must be relative in order to be absolute, but one cannot simply convert the proposition. It is false that something relative must be absolute in order to be relative. The absolute is relative in virtue of its absoluteness, but relative existence is not necessarily absolute in virtue of its relative being. Ironically, this distinction is true because the contradiction is true. And since the absolute is relative, the absolute exists as that which is other to relative being. The absolute, in virtue of relativizing itself, cannot exist as that which lacks absolute power. And because the absolute has made itself relative and the relative is not the absolute being must exist as an alienated expression of the absolute outside itself. And since the relative can only be absolute by negating itself, and qua relative being is helpless to absolutize itself, it is only by the power of the absolute that the negation of the absolute, the relative, can negate itself and return to absoluteness. In fact, since self-negation is the power in virtue of which the absolute determines itself, the relative can only negate itself by relying upon the absolute power of self-negation. Okay, this final section is on infinite personality. Because the intellectual intuition of the absolute is not other to the absolute, and the absolute is free and self-determining, the intellectual intuition of the absolute is the experience of the absolute as infinite and free self-consciousness. Free self-consciousness is what constitutes personality. In the pure experience of philosophical religion, the absolute appears as infinite and free personality. It appears as God. We will remember that mystical dialetheism is constituted by the experience of infinite subjectivity, where the subject of consciousness is indistinct from the object of consciousness. The pure experience of mystical dialetheism directly demonstrates the existence of God, the infinite and absolute presence of the self-relating subjectivity or personality in each and every object. The infinite and self-determining subjectivity is absolute freedom. But since the absolute conceptualizes itself, the infinite and absolute non-discursive self-consciousness encountered in mysticism conceptualizes itself too. Thus, the self-universalization of the absolute is nothing less than the self-conceptualization of infinite personality. Because the absolute exists in virtue of itself, the absolute concept is self-particularizing, and this self-particularization is the conceptual self-expression of God's absolute agency. Following Nishida, expression is always the externalization of agency and subjectivity, such that in the logic of the self-predicative concept we find infinite personality rendered scientific. The absolute agency of personhood now exists as the concept and exists in virtue of itself. It is existentially implicative. In this way, Hegel is right to describe the absolute idea as pure personality. In order to know the absolute, the knowing of the absolute cannot be other to the absolute itself. Otherwise, the absolute would be relative to a knowing that would exist beyond it. And if the knowing of the absolute were beyond the absolute itself, the absolute would be conditioned by that knowing, such that both the absolute and the knowing of the absolute would be merely relative beings. Thus, the philosophical knowing of the absolute must be the absolute's knowledge of itself. In order to be true to itself, to be absolutely absolute, the absolute cannot be absolutely other to human knowing of the absolute. As Hegel says, God is God only insofar as he knows himself. This self-knowledge is further a self-consciousness in man and man's knowledge of God, which proceeds to man's self-knowledge in God, close quote. Okay. I need 5 more minutes. I'm sorry, I'm 5 minutes behind. That's okay. We're almost done with the day. Thanks, Hayden. Because the thinking of the absolute is the absolute's thinking of itself, the intellectual intuition of the absolute is the pure experience of human freedom. The human subject experiences the absolute in the pure experience of absolute thinking, and thereby discovers that the freedom of the absolute is their own birthright. We remember that you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. This is, I think, on the philosophy building in Freiburg. Simply put, we are set free by participating in the absolute freedom of God's personality. By thinking the absolute as personality, we do not invent God by externalizing ourselves in an object. Quite the opposite. We discover God as the infinite source to which we have returned. To evoke Schelling's apt description, philosophical religion consists in person seeking person. We seek the origin of our personhood in God, and God contemplates and authentically realizes their own divine personhood through the agency of human personhood. Because the absolute is relative to nothing, we human beings exist in the absolute and are subject to its self-determining power. And since we exist in virtue of its self-determination, we finite human beings exist as self-particularizations of the absolute. And insofar as the particularization of the absolute is the absolute that is outside itself, or the absolute in purely relative form, as finite agents, we exist as self-expressions and externalizations of absolute freedom. Insofar as the absolute appears other to us, the absolute is relativized as beyond its finite expressions. But this is not an objection to the absolute, but its realization. For absolute spirit is absolute because it is not relative. It must be other to the relative spirit to be what it is. As absolute spirit, it cannot preclude relativity. It must itself exist in relative form. Thus, absolute spirit can authentically appear as other to finite subjectivity. Having finitized itself, the absolute becomes accessible to finite cognition, and our finitude is no longer an obstacle to absolute knowing. Astonishingly, it is by finitizing and positing itself as other to us, we are able to unify the absolute truth. The absolute relativizes itself, and it is exactly that unity of the absolute and the relative that must be realized in order for the human being to achieve absolute knowledge. Certainly, it would be vain, even evil, to suppose that we absolutize ourselves as merely finite beings. People accuse Hegel of this. Maybe he did. Thankfully, we are unified with the absolute not by our own power as relative beings, for the relative is nothing without the absolute and cannot absolutize itself. To the contrary, because it relativizes itself, it is by the power of the absolute that absolute spirit is united with relative spirit. The contradictory power consists in the fact that the very same power by which God is other to humanity is the same power by which they are unified. In fact, it is only by letting go of our vanity, only by freeing letting go of the urge to usurp the place of God, that we can begin to appreciate the work of reconciliation that absolute spirit has achieved on our behalf. As Nishida teaches, quote, our religious awareness does not arise from out of ourself, but it is God's call, Buddha's call. It is the work of God or Buddha and arises from the very ground where our self comes into being, close quote. Upon recognizing our own personality or our own person as an expression of the absolute and absolute knowing, finite personality meets infinite personality. This is a relation of one to another, God and humanity, but also a self-recognition of each for itself. And since the absolute is the infinite personality, absolute self-knowledge consists in the knowing that the human person is a self-objectification of the absolute personality. We're almost there. The infinite personality finitizes itself in us through which it is conscious of itself in finite form. Of course, the absolute alienates itself from itself in many ways. It impersonalizes itself in the form of stones and cosmic dust, in which the absolute self-relation is lost and the absolute is alienated from its freedom and personality. However, by learning that I am an expression of the absolute, I learn that the absolute is not only self-particularizing, but overcomes its self-alienation in finite being and in me, so that it can be true to itself in its expressive form. The absolute can return to itself through us, so that through our finite personhood, infinite personhood can be recognized in the life of finite existence. We can remain alienated from ourselves in many ways. We can remain alienated by failing to acknowledge human freedom and personhood, that is, by absolutizing impersonality, mechanical and chemical existence. We can also remain alienated by only acknowledging the finitude of human spirit. On the other end, we can remain alienated by refusing to acknowledge the asymmetry between ourselves and the absolute. And since the absolute is absolutely self-relating, in order for the absolute to be true to itself in its expressive form, human beings should realize their capacity for absolute knowing. They ought to think about themselves in relation to the absolute of which they are the expression. So finishing up here. When the eye by which I see God is the eye by which God sees me, the human knowledge of the absolute is the absolute's knowledge of itself. And this self-relation constitutes a true contradiction. I am a relative and finite consciousness, as such I am not infinite. As Nishida says, quote, the world of the self, the human world, is grounded in the paradox of the absolute, so that as finite self-expressions of the absolute, quote, we exist as the ultimate limits of the self-negation of the absolute. However, the consciousness of which I am aware is infinite. It is the absolute. Thus, I am raised to infinity. And since in absolute self-knowledge, the human self-knowing of the absolute is true to the absolute self-knowing consists in the correspondence of finite with infinite self-awareness. As Nishida aptly puts it, religion concerns the contradictory unity of God and the human being. It's a long quote. The relationship between God and human beings, viewed from the human perspective, is aptly described by Daito Kokushi's words: separated by an eternity and not separated even for an instant, face to face the whole day, yet not face to face even an instant. This is the principle according to which human beings exist. These words touch upon the contradictory self-identical relationship between God and the human being, close quote. In the transconsistent self-correspondence of finite with infinite self-consciousness in the pure experience constituted by intuitive understanding, knowledge of the absolute is constituted by a true contradiction, absolute dialethism. And in absolute knowing, the correspondence of thought with the object is transconsistent self-consciousness. To quote Nishida again, that which knows is that which is known could be thought of as a contradiction. Yet, where it is thought of as a contradiction, there lies the significance of true self-awareness. All right, really finishing. When the finite person seeks infinite personality can exist in finite form, and finite personality can exist in infinite form. God transcends God into humanity. Humanity transcends humanity into God. The double ecstasis is the contradiction that constitutes absolute knowledge. The absolute person can be found in the finite person, for each and every finite person is an expression of the absolute that is true to itself whenever it recognizes itself as such. In absolute self-knowledge, theosis meets incarnation, learning that we are begotten by God, incarnations of the absolute. Infinite personality has incarnated itself in us and recovered its absolute personality through finite self-consciousness. God doubles himself in finite personalities, returns to himself, and is true to himself in creation, such that the Holy Spirit, the absolute spirit, is the true Henkaipan. Okay, conclusion. The age of the anthropos is a trans-anthropological age. It's a kairos of the theos, a theocene. The theocene marks this distinct metaphysical and theological epoch, an epoch in which the absolute first appears in the light of truth. And we philosophers are called to carry the torch of the absolute, to preserve the light whereby truth is revealed in every age. In the 21st century, we are called back to the condition of all thinghood, the absolute. Back to the world itself, back to the absolute. Now and always, the call back to infinite personality and absolute spirit is the demand and rallying cry of speculative and dialectical thinking. Thanks. Sorry for going over. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Professor Moss. We've got some time for
CY has a
questions, comments, professions of conversion.
or deconversion.
Deconversion, tour from mystical dialectism.
Yeah.
Do I need to use this?
Oh yes, here, let me give this to you.
Thank you so much for your wonderful talk. My question is on the ideas of the concept of God, or Nishi. From what we heard from your argumentation, the absolute has to be exist has to be true, and this absolute God is a kind of really it's a true God to us. But towards the end of his, the very late Nishida, he also mentioned that he's not using the word absolute God, but a true God. So true God has to be both God and also Satan, the most extreme evil and the most extreme good. With all these, contradictory elements, it comes to the true God, right? And I think this kind of logic is very consistent. So even logic, we have to both include the contradictory good and evil, and now we have the true good, etc. And the problem is that exactly lies in your conclusion that when we are in our 21st century, we have to deal with not just this, trans-ethical or trans-religious assumption. We still have to go back to good and evil. We need to say something is wrong. This is evil. This is killing. This is evil. This cannot be, justified by the absolute. So, or in the name of God, exactly in the name of the absolute, the power will justify they are all wrongdoing by all this kind of absolute idea. So I'm not sure if I'm clear enough, but Nishida, from my point of view, Nishida is very consistent in doing this contradictory self-identity, but it has the problem of ignoring our everyday ethical issues. And we cannot just ask for a God and Satan. You cannot just explain there is a true God to someone who only believes in Satan or only believe in believe in Satan.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, CY. The next book, well, after the one Dennis and I write, is going to be about ethics. So you've put your finger on something I don't like in late Nishida. You know that, yeah. So you know exactly this. I think of evil. So going back to Tanabe's point about radical evil, we were looking at this in Satoshi's talk. That radical evil has to do with a finite free being who wills to be absolute by their own power alone. And one of the arguments I made is that in the text is that the human being, here talking about the philosopher who needs to be absolute to know the absolute, can only achieve that by the power of the absolute. So the argument that I made is actually that if it's true that this thinking about goodness as this, or thinking about radical evil as the attempt to will the absolute by one's own power, I kind of explicitly saying that this is impossible, right? That also informed my question to Satoshi, right? That absolute evil actually can't realize what it wants, because it wants to do something that it can't achieve. Right? It has to rely upon an absolute power to do it, but it denies that absolute power. So I think there's nothing about Nishida's logic. I think Nishida made a mistake here. So this is what I want to say. This is Nishida inspired, but not just, so you've already helped me as I asked you to tell me what the difference is. And I think I already know what I want it to be, which is that the absolute has to relativize itself, but that doesn't mean that the relative being, like CY, must attempt to usurp the place of God. And I think just because the absolute is contradictory doesn't necessarily mean that that particular contradiction has to be true, right? That the good has to make itself evil. So I think Nishida's made a mistake here. That's what I think. Yeah, so thanks so much, but you put your finger on a big problem.
Okay, I've got a couple more questions on the board. Just one moment here.
This is the last session, so please just no holds barred, folks.
Sure. Thank you, Greg, for this free solo on the absolute contradiction. I mean, it still amazed me even after these 2 weeks. My question is short. It's related to the Professor Priest mention of silence in the Vimala 30 and also like to Shabdashua's 3 sort of layers of silence. It seems to me like just appears to me like silence just really a good embodiment of this philosophical religion, because on the one hand, it's kind of embodied of this non-conditional, non-conceptual absolute, right? On the other hand, because it's a silence to a question, so it's become a certain conceptual negation and self-negation in it. So I think, but it seems seemingly this silence is sort of a good representation of the philosophical religion, but just because of its own ambiguity, right? There's no way to tell which part of silence is a philosophical and which part is religious. I guess there's also like ambiguity of the philosophical religion and the religious philosophy. I guess my question is, if this ambiguity, right, whether between philosophical religion and religious philosophy is something we want to differentiate, or is a difference that we want to remain silent to?
That's okay. That's my job.
Okay, look, working out what philosophical religion exactly is has been a struggle in the book. So I'll admit my struggles, as Nishida always did at the end of Basho. I couldn't express what I wanted to say, as he says. But the struggles aside, so I think silence is important, but it's one-sided. So I think if the absolute is only achieved in silence, it's a false absolute. It's fake, actually. And that's why Nishida says you need the word. You need the word. Of course, in the sense of logos, you need some kind of conceptual structure, basically. But of course, it has to be paradoxical. It has to be effable and ineffable, as we just heard in the previous talk. So I think you're right. Silence is somehow essential, but it's also one-sided. So this is a worry that I've had. I used to think it was just, I just wanted mysticism to be true, but I think this was a kind of one-sidedness, right? So if the absolute is achieved in silence, this is a kind of one-sided absolute. So it's missing science, it's missing logic, it's missing a lot. Yeah, so it's not the full story. But you're right, having a kind of silence that says something versus silence that doesn't, this is always difficult stuff, okay? So I don't have a treatise ready on this. The philosophical religion and religious philosophy side, the simple way to begin to distinguish it, and it's not sufficient, is to think that if I begin from this non-conceptual position, this is self-conceptualizing. So that religion is self-philosophizing. This is basically what Nishida says. He talks about self-rationalization or self-universalization. But then there's also the other direction, which is to say you start from philosophy, you should indeed be interested in practicing religion. Because the idea is that this absolute concept is, one could say, self-relativizing, thereby generating a situation where you have an opposition between the concept and the absolute. And that sets up the conditions for religious practice. That could even be something like meditation practice in a very general sense. Does that make sense? So the philosophy become religion or religion become philosophy. Those are the directions that define how you describe it. I think Hegel would be unhappy with me saying philosophy becomes religion. He likes religion transforming into philosophy and phenomenology, but then he says it doesn't go back down. I think Nishida has it go back down, and so would I like this as well.
Okay, great. I've got 4 hands left, so I'll encourage everyone to keep their remarks finite.
Oh, no.
Cool. Thank you so much for such a wonderful talk. I feel like you've been giving us hints throughout the past 2 weeks, and now we've gotten the secret. So I really appreciate this. Yeah. So I just wanted to invite you to maybe elaborate the very initial premise of your talk, which I'm kind of curious about. So it seems like the beginning of the idea that the concept is universal and fundamental begins from the idea that every determination of mind independence remains internal to the concept. And I understand the argument here being something like, when you're trying to think about mind independence, you're thinking about it, therefore mind independence is inconceivable. We should therefore, we should basically just get rid of the idea of mind independence, because if you try to think of it, it's already internal to thought. But my concern is that seems like a little tautological, right? Every time you think something, you are thinking of it, right? But then, which is fine, it's a tautology, and that sort of works in its own way. But to derive a non-tautological conclusion from a tautology is difficult, right? Because the idea that when you're thinking about something, you're thinking about it, then to conclude that everything that exists is thought, or that there's nothing that's not thought, that's not a tautology. So I want you to elaborate maybe that move, the elimination of mind independence. So thank you. Yeah.
So you got half of my book in 1 hour. So even if you didn't understand anything I said, you get a sense of the kind of thing that happens. You can take your time on vacation or something. But yeah, I want to address this because on the one hand, you might think we're talking about mind independence. But in fact, I was thinking about something, I was thinking about the concept as a universal. So you can run the same argument by just asking, is the world categorically structured? Can I find something that transcends, say, categorical structure, right? And then the idea was no. That may or may not have any implications about mind independence. It just says that you can't actually, in discourse and in philosophizing, give a counterexample to the view that whatever there is instantiates some universal. So that doesn't necessarily have to do with the mind. Although in the end, as you see, I do think that, I do take an idealist position that reality is infinite self-consciousness. That's what God signifies, right? And it's close to the consciousness only bit, it's just that I use a different word for it, okay? But you have a good point. Whether you run the argument with mind independence or you run the argument the way that I'm telling you that I meant to run it, You can have the same charge of tautology and that it just begs the question, basically, even. And that's why it's important to say, just assume that the absolute is, one could say, totally conceptually structured. And then what you see is that this, through this dialectical logic, would undermine itself, right? Leaving you into this say, situation where the absolute is ineffable and non-conceptualizable. So the point is then once, say, if you hypothetically say, well, let's run it and see what happens, you end up with the position where the absolute and the kind of, the concept are divided, and then you have this religious position. But that also undermines itself, bringing you back to the rational position or the conceptual position. So the point actually is the proof of that, the fact that the absolute is conceptual, you can run it really to see why it must be. You have to go through the religious side, see how it undermines itself and brings you back to that position. Do you see what I mean? You can hypothetically take it and say, what happens if you took this position? It would undermine itself. But then this religious position would also undermine itself, bringing you back to the position that you started from. So if you said, reality is not totally conceptual, you would end up with a conceptual view of reality. That's why at the end I say, oh, now the ontological argument really is justified now. Now I can come back to the position that says the absolute is conceptual. I hope that makes sense. If it doesn't, there's the book. Yeah.
Hi, Greg. There's a lot there, and I don't pretend to understand a lot of it. I can just focus on a little bit of it. It's what you call the ontological argument. I guess I'm skeptical of ontological arguments. So if it's possible, I just wanted you to talk me very slowly through the ontological argument. Maybe we can start with, ontological arguments start with the definition of the thing you want to prove to exist. So let's start with the definition of the ultimate. The ultimate is?
The absolute, or what is relative to nothing.
So the absolute is something that is relative to nothing, the thing that is relative to nothing, everything that is relative to nothing?
So we're actually beginning with an absolute concept, right? So we have a concept that's kind of all-encompassing.
Okay, so the absolute is a concept which applies to everything. The concept which applies to everything?
Yes.
Because there seem to be lots of concepts that apply to everything.
Yes. So in this case, I just use being.
Sorry?
I use being, but we could have used other ones.
Okay, so let's start from there. So the absolute is the concept that applies to everything. Now, how does the ontological argument go?
Yeah, so this is perhaps, this may be a misnomer, because my main point is simply the same that you made in your talk when you were talking about the basho of all bashos, that it must be an instance of itself. That's the idea, right? Because it is in fact absolute, it has to apply back to itself. It has to be placed in itself. So that's really all that I mean by it. So that the description of the ontological argument there may be misleading, highly misleading. Yeah, but this is all that I mean to express by it.
Okay, but there do seem to be lots of concepts that apply to everything.
Yes,
like
that's true.
Is self-identical, is an object.
That's true.
That's
true. That's true.
So
yes. That's true. That's right.
You seem to have a very special one in mind.
Yeah.
So
yes.
let's. What characterizes that particular concept that applies to everything?
Well, do I have a special one in mind? My main goal there is to distinguish between the way that absolute concepts work, and I do regularly speak in the plural, and the way merely relative ones, like say color works, right? So the concept of color is not a color, but the concept of being ends up being itself a being, just like the concept of nothing ends up being an instance of itself. So that's the main function of and being is taken up as an example. If we were to think about the absolute as such, like in its totality, like all of the
all of the features of it, you would need a lot more. This book wouldn't be sufficient, right? So I just work it out in the case of being, but not in the case of every other, as you said, predicate that might also apply to it.
Okay, so
So
now,
it's not complete as it stands.
okay, so now,
That's true.
now we're talking about the concept of being, and we need an argument that it is being, and that's contentious because Heidegger, for example, doesn't think it is.
Yeah, but
So what's the
Heidegger's
argument?
confused. Heidegger's deeply confused because
so
Heidegger
what-
actually, no, but Heidegger does think that it is in the end. He actually says that the ontological difference collapses.
He comes to think that in the end.
Yeah,
Okay.
exactly. And
But
that's
what's
when he's
your-
not confused.
What's your argument?
Yeah,
Okay,
so-
look.
Yeah.
Okay,
Okay.
the time is getting short.
The time's getting
we
short,
can
Graham.
pursue this over dinner.
Yeah, okay, good. Let me briefly say something about this, though, because I think Heidegger realizes that when you have the ontological difference between being and beings, you end up actually you end up actually stating something about being, right? You end up saying that it is not beings. So you treat it as a subject of predication, right? So if you think about beings or the kinds of things that you can talk about, of which assertions can be made, then being must be a being, right? So it's exactly in virtue of not being a being that it ends up being one. It's exactly the kind of argument that you use all the time with nothingness, I think, right? It's ineffable, and you say that, and then it becomes effable. So I think it's a very similar argument.
All right,
Anyway.
if you want the
Yes.
follow-up on that, try to get a seat within earshot at dinner. We'll see how that plays out. One last one's going to have to be quite brief.
Okay, I have actually two questions, which I'll keep them very brief. One of them is fairly simple because because this notion of mystical intuition, and when you start off the process with mystical intuition in the Schellingian way, sort of, I want you to address like Hegel's criticisms of that possibility in the first place, which are like ample of them. Like how do you make sense of those criticisms? And the second, more substantial question is basically that this idea that the non-conceptual, right? And you're like, we had discussed this earlier, that Hegel's concept, it's on the nomatic side, and like it somehow fails to assimilate the non-conceptual, trans-conceptual. What I'm thinking is, yeah, sure, one might argue that is the case, but at the same time, why should we take this non-conceptuality to be necessarily an opening for some kind of mystical intuition, as opposed to the very concrete alterity of things in their existence? Because I think Hegel's larger point in general was, this is again a very materialistic kind of Hegel that I'm sure you're aware. So is that thought and the order of being, like being like this thing, somewhere there is a connection. So, but if you just enter the order of thought and you create a being within the realm of thought, that's not what I think Hegel is suggesting. So this non-conceptuality can take the form of concrete things as well, right? That's a possibility where mysticism can be countered from the world of finite things. And I think even Nishida's pure experience somewhere signals that instead of a mysticism in some sense. What do you think? Yeah, do you think this is can be a suitable counter to the, this smuggling in of mysticism?
What's the other proposal?
That, non-conceptual things exist, and like this is like a non-conceptual thing, yeah.
Yeah, I don't see it as a counter. I see it that when you zoom out maximally, you have this unity of concept and non-conceptual. And when you zoom in maximally, this phenomenology of spirit, this is, I mean something that isn't a universal, but then I say this, I say universal. So by my lights, this contradiction in which you have this unity of the concept and non-conceptual is a feature of the maxing out or zooming out and zooming in, right? So the implications for experience and for perception are to be worked out, but basically I think you have to rethink perception in light of the story about epsilon. Oh, yes. Well, first, it's just not Hegelian what I'm doing in this way at all. Oh, no. So the non-conceptual is there, for example, in
and in what you mean, as Hegel says. But you can't say what you mean. That's what Hegel says, right? So you mean what is not conceptual, but you say what is conceptual, right? So, but I think you can connect it to mysticism because what Nishida says in the late work is that this religious experience is not opposed to everydayness, right? So just like pure experience of hearing and seeing, those are the prime examples of pure experience. And for him, pure experience is this indistinction of subject and object, or very ordinary hearing and seeing. And so the fact that you can't find an object that isn't itself subjective, according to Nishida, means that you experience God directly, even in hearing and seeing. So every ordinary experience is an experience of infinite subjectivity. So I don't think what I'm saying is in any way inconsistent with that, but in fact entails it, actually.
Okay, everyone, please join me once again in thanking Professor Moss. Thanks.
Kyle, we have to do some last words. Yes, so we have a closing ceremony for the conference before we go to dinner tonight. So Dennis and Kyle, you guys, come on up here. For those of you in the summer school, thanks, you made it. You survived it. All right. So I think we're sitting down. Right in the middle. Dennis. Oh, you have to stand. Dennis, you have to stand in the middle. Sure. No.
First, I think in terms of the conference, what I just want to, I want to start by saying thank you to all the keynotes outside of us, as we had no choice. But for Professor Uehara to join via Zoom, for Professor Urai, for Professor Itabashi, for Professor Priest, Professor Chong, for everyone to come in kind of from all over, although actually in this case I think everyone's coming from Asia, but still, for the keynotes. It really means a lot to us, first off. And I think it means a lot, and now I'll shift a little bit to the workshop, to all the students who kind of participated. We had these themes, totality and contradiction, and there's a number of reasons that we chose it, mostly because I think Greg, Dennis, and I are all trying to theorize the Kyoto School in terms of totality in radically contradictory ways. But also because our hope is that by the end of this, students will have gotten a sense of kind of the whole of the Kyoto School, but also a number of different perspectives from which you can understand the Kyoto School and almost like competing understandings of the Kyoto School. And then by virtue of the keynotes, I feel like this kind of these differing approaches to the Kyoto School will really put, really spotlight it. So I hope that everyone who's attended the conference and attended the summer school has kind of come to a richer understanding of the Kyoto School in all of its heterogeneity.
Dennis, I don't know how it works.
Yeah, no, exactly what you say. I mean, I really enjoyed these past 2 weeks. Interaction with the participants was great. I think in the case of participants, we were very lucky to have you as our participants, I personally think. So you made this first summer school a big success, if you ask me. So participants, thank you.
Yeah, and I think we're going to send around, I didn't consult with you guys yet, but an anonymous maybe survey to see what you guys liked and what you might suggest for future students. The next iteration of the summer school, which we hope to do again. When and how exactly is another question. So look out for that. I think we are going to put something together.
Yep. Not next year, though. We'll be
Well, I don't know. Really?
Greg's enthusiasm got us into this in the first
It's that optimism of Tanabe that I have. It's this optimism that evil can't win. Anyway, that makes me need more summer schools. Okay. Also want to thank Ivy and Andy because wow, you all are amazing, and you had to suffer through 2 weeks of this. So let's give them a round. Is Wilson here? He helped out. With that, I guess we'll close, yeah? So those of you who are speakers or students, we're gonna have a dinner. Yeah, so, yeah. Oh, yes. What time is the bus leaving? Okay. You should have time then. You have about 25 minutes. So is the bus coming here? So just put your stuff away and then come back here if you want to. Oh, wait, hold on. Everyone stop. Everyone. We're going to do a group photo. I forgot.